All right. In the meantime, let's begin. We'll call the October 18th, 2017 Planning Commission meeting to order. And that means we begin with the Planning Director's report. Oh, we begin with roll call.
Commissioner Anderson? Here. Commissioner Fonda Bernardi?
Here.
Commissioner Kennedy? Here. Commissioner Perry?
Here.
And Chair Fresco?
Here. Then we do the Planning Commission Director's report.
Good evening, Commission. So I wanted to go over the upcoming agenda schedule and then also some things coming up at City Council that you'd be interested in. So the next, the meeting on November 1st will be at the main library, so we're switching back. Projects on that agenda: 929 Colorado, which is an alcohol CUP. 2215 5th Street, which is a development review permit, CUP and track map. And then a project on Euclid, 1550 Euclid, which is a office building at the corner of Euclid and Colorado. And then there's also a presentation of the well-being index at the November 1st meeting. On November 15th, we'll be back here at the Civic Auditorium, and that will be for a priority discussion for the projects coming up in the planning, mainly in the planning division, but also mobility to some extent. So we're talking about the PICO plan, Memorial Park plan, the Gateway Access plan, and getting ready to go to City Council in December with the priorities. And then on the December 6th, meeting again at the main library, so we'll be alternating back and forth. On that agenda, we have 601 Wilshire and 1443 Lincoln, which are both development review permits for mixed-use housing projects. And then on December 13th, we have a project at 2225 Broadway. That's a development review permit. That's tentative at this point, but that's what we're planning for the 13th of December. And then coming up at City Council on October 24th, we have some Mills Act contracts. On November 28th, the zoning ordinance amendments that you'll be discussing tonight, assuming they move forward. And then on December 5th is the appeal of the child care facility on Delaware. And then December 12th, again, the council priorities. So the priorities that you'll be discussing in November will be taking forward to City Council in December. That concludes my report.
Thank you very much. Is there any, no, there's, okay. So our next item is a presentation on the Seismic Retrofit program. Presenter is Salvatore Valles. Is that you?
Could I propose that we take the consent calendar item before the presentation and the continuation of the 1430 hearing?
You want to do both of those before this?
No. Can I propose that we move the consent calendar item to before the presentation and the
okay.
public hearing for 1430 Lincoln?
Before both of those. Is there a second for that? Yeah. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. So on our consent calendar, we have a tract map. That's the one, right?
Mm-hmm.
For 1900 20th Street. Does anyone want to?
I would move approval.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Done. So now we will hear from Mr. Valles on the seismic retrofit.
Good evening. My name is Salvador Valles. I'm the Assistant Director for Planning and Community Development. We wanted to give you an update or an overview of the Seismic Retrofit program. As an introduction, I think everyone knows sort of the purpose of the program, but I just wanted to give you just a sort of a recap, a quick recap of sort of how we got here. As you all know, in 1994, after the Northridge Earthquake Council adopted some emergency ordinances to deal with that event, in 1999, a mandatory seismic retrofit program was established and is very similar to the program we have today, although one of the main differences is, although the program was mandatory in 1999, the program today is mandatory but with enforcement components as well added to it. There are 5 building types that are under the seismic retrofit program. I'll go over them just very quickly. The standards are based on the type of building and the age of the building. Unreinforced masonry, concrete tilt-ups, soft stories. Soft stories are the largest group of buildings that we have in the program, and we'll show you the numbers as part of the presentation. Non-ductile concrete, and then of course steel moment frames. One thing I will say about these building types is that they do all have sort of different characteristics that make the retrofits different as well. One of the things I forgot to do at the very beginning is to introduce our building officer, Chris Lee. Chris Lee used to be our assistant building officer and recently was appointed to building officer. And if you have some more technical questions related to the building types or technical aspects of how a retrofit might work for a particular building, Chris can certainly answer some of those questions for you. So from an administrative standpoint, the process is fairly straightforward. We have begun the noticing process, and in a later slide I'll show you exactly sort of which buildings we've been noticing. There is an appeal period where an owner can appeal the decision that the building should even be on the list in the first place, that they even need a retrofit. We have implemented an administrative review first so that the building owner doesn't necessarily have to go to the Fire Life Safety Commission if we think that they've provided enough evidence to us to demonstrate that a building in fact has been retrofitted already. But if we disagree with them and the building officer upholds his order saying you must retrofit this building, you must get a structural review, then they do have the ability to then appeal to the Fire Life Safety Commission. The building owner is then required to provide a structural analysis report, and that is reviewed by the building officer to determine whether or not they agree, whether or not he agrees with that report. The report could come back saying that certain aspects are needed in terms of a retrofit, or they may come back and say that the building is retrofitted and doesn't need to be retrofitted. Once that analysis is completed, the building officer will then make a ruling as to whether or not they agree with the report. They may ask for modifications, or they may accept it, and then the process would continue. There is another appeal at that point as well. So once that decision has been established, then any decision by the building officer can then again be appealed by to the Fire Life Safety Commission. Once this portion of the process has been completed, then of course then they would be entering into the plan check process to actually complete the work if a retrofit is needed. With the way the ordinance is established today, all entitlement requirements, permit review requirements are in effect. So if a building, depending upon the scope of work of which they wish to do, requires an ARB or landmarks approval, they would need to continue to get those approvals. In many cases, in most cases, for a retrofit, we don't know that that would be necessary, but in some cases it could very well be necessary. They would also need to obtain building permits and then any of the tenant protections that apply for any building permit that's issued would also apply. So anytime there is a tenant-occupied building, the owner is required to provide a means and methods that would explain what the impacts will be on those tenants for the type of construction work that's going to take place, and then to offer mitigation for those impacts, which could include relocating the tenants if necessary, and we do have those occur on occasion. It's not frequent that tenants are relocated due to construction, but it has happened, and we do have several cases currently where tenants are in fact relocated due to construction. And then of course the very end of the process is that the work is then, once the permits are issued, the work is completed, and it goes through the normal standard inspection process as well. Some of the components that are, again, more administrative relative to the program, there are some very specific timeframes that must be met for completing the retrofit, but we've established within the ordinance the option to request extensions. The Director of Planning and Community Development can issue an extension to any of those deadlines, and it's at the discretion of the Director to determine whether or not the reasons for that extension are reasonable. Additionally, the parking requirements, there is an option for the zoning administrator, in this case that would be Jing, would be able to administratively consider a reduction in parking of up to 20% or one space in order to accommodate the retrofit, and it would be the zoning administrator, at the zoning administrator's discretion to determine whether or not the request is reasonable in terms of whether or not the retrofit needed to go forward and the kind of construction that they were proposing was necessary to complete it, and that the loss of one space or up to 20% would be okay. Additionally, currently we have a 500-foot radius primarily within residential areas for construction activities, and this would waive that requirement for the retrofit types of work. So this again only applies if they are in fact only doing a retrofit. The exemption to this particular requirement. Trash screening enclosures as well. The Public Works Director in this case could waive or reduce the requirements for trash enclosures, and this again would be if the Director of Public Works determined that in order to complete the retrofit it would be necessary to waive or reduce those requirements in the interest of getting that retrofit completed. Also, as I mentioned before, one of the other components of this program is we do have enforcement components built in as well. We're utilizing our existing code enforcement procedures, but within the program that was developed to track and monitor the retrofits, we have a system that's available online, and I'll show you an example of that, where we are tracking every single building that has been noticed so that we know where they are in the process and what the deadlines are for them to comply with, and if they don't, then those owners would be referred to code enforcement for enforcement action. So it's that monitoring that's going to assist us with the compliance. Pass-through costs are a big question and a big issue, and the Rent Control Board is currently addressing that question, and some of you may have seen articles in the local press about that, but they are currently still reviewing that and have not made any determinations as to how they'll address any potential pass-throughs to the tenant for the cost of the retrofit. Financing is another big question and issue that comes up periodically with regards to the retrofit program. The city has not established any city programs specifically, meaning the city is not providing loans or any kind of funding for the retrofits. The city does participate in the PACE financing program, and that's administered through the Office of Sustainability in terms of information, but there are specific lenders who participate in that program. A building owner is able to get up to 100% of financing, and then the repayments on that are included as part of the tax bill, and they follow the property, not the owner. So if the owner were to sell the property, the remaining payments due that get issued through the tax assessments would then be picked up by the new owner at that point. We're also going to be conducting some community meetings. The first one will be November 13th in this same room here, and then we'll have more. The November 13th meeting will be focused primarily on soft stories, and landlords and tenants are being invited to participate in that meeting. So in terms of the types of buildings and the numbers, as you can see, again, soft stories are the largest representation. For URMs, you'll notice that we've actually already removed quite a few of those buildings, and we've done that through an administrative process where we did a second evaluation. The 2007 number that's there was a point in time when we uploaded all of the information into the database where we track. A case was created for every single one of these properties. So from that point forward, we now have to track every single one to determine, is it still on the list, what's the status of that building, and has it been taken off the list? So that's why we're now tracking the fact that even those URMs were taken off administratively, we're still tracking those, because as part of our compliance efforts, we want to make sure we know the status of every single one of those buildings that we placed on that list at that point in time. So the list of buildings is available. We have an interactive website map that allows an individual to go and search for a particular address. They can use the map to zero in on a particular property. They are color-coded based on the building type, and there's information that you can get on that specific building. So the little pop-up window that you saw related to the one particular parcel, you can see here, this is the type of information that's available to anybody who comes to the website and searches a particular address. You can see that it's a soft story building. There's the address. The priority designation, meaning this will get noticed later. The priority designations are established in the code to show which building should we be noticing first based on how hazardous they might be. The status is also indicated here, and you can see that the notices are scheduled to be sent November 27th to this particular property owner. There are 2 stories, there's 10 units, and it also shows what the compliance dates are for it. And then at the very bottom, you'll see that's the actual case number that we're tracking for this particular property. This is an example of just 2 more, so you can see how the statuses and information are different. So in the case of 101 Wilshire Boulevard, you can see that they have filed an appeal. They have appealed the order to retrofit, and so it is now in that process. That's a concrete tilt-up building, and in the case of the other, you can see that a notice was issued in that case. So again, this map is available online and for anyone to take a look at. So in terms of compliance, you can see that depending upon the building type, there are different time frames for compliance. The first compliance date is the date that the structural evaluation is due. For the URMs, for the unreinforced masonry buildings, you can see it's a very, very short time frame. They must complete their evaluations within 3 months of notice, and all of those notices have gone out already. Steel moment frames, you can see, have the longest with 20 years to complete their retrofits. There was much debate over these time frames, and there's a structural organization locally for Southern California, and I think Chris participated in that while he was still here, and our prior building officer. And so, and that same group also worked with Los Angeles in establishing their retrofit program. And so these timeframes are fairly consistent with what LA chose to do as well. There's some differences. I think LA only has 2 building types, and I think they gave the concrete buildings 25 years, if I'm not mistaken. So in terms of the where we are in terms of our noticing, the very top 3 in the darkest color there, these groups have already been noticed, and those are the actual numbers of the notices that went out for each of those. And then the second lighter color of 3, the soft story, the non-ductile concrete, and the still moment frame. And for the soft story, that's just for 16 or more units. This notice is scheduled to go out on October 23rd, and you can see the different numbers there in terms of how many will go out. And then later in November will be the next phase of soft story, and then we'll postpone after Christmas, and then begin noticing the largest group of soft stories, which are 2 stories with fewer than 7 units. And those will go out over the course of next year. So that concludes my presentation, and we're available for any questions that you may have.
You have some questions?
Can you tell us about, is this working here? No. How's this? Yeah, okay. Can you talk about the appeal kind of process, what that's about? On what basis are appeals granted, and how the appeal timeline fits within the allowed timeline for producing evaluations and the other steps in the process?
So the appeal timeline, these appeals would go to the Fire Life Safety Commission. Any decision of the building officer is appealable to the Fire Life Safety Commission. For these particular appeals, they are allowed 60 days to appeal. The commission must issue an order within, or a decision within 90 days of when that appeal was filed. So in terms of who can appeal or on what basis they can appeal, and they can appeal on any grounds whatsoever. We don't deny an appeal. The commission will hear them, and then the commission will issue its determination. If in fact they feel, the owner feels at that time that they need additional time because of the appeal, they can make a request of the director for additional time, but they are not granted time automatically. And so it would really be at the director's discretion as to whether or not the request was reasonable for additional time based on the circumstances of the appeal or whatever that might have been. But they're not granted that additional time automatically.
And the 60 plus that have been removed from the list, is that a product of the appeals process, or that's something separate?
For the URM specifically, we had, because we were concerned that there may have been some errors in the list because of just some record-keeping issues. What we did was we sent all of those owners what we called a soft notice. It was not a notice from the building officer, it was a notice from me, basically saying, if you would like the opportunity to provide us with any additional documentation that you may have that shows that your building was retrofitted, we will review that. And we called it a request for reconsideration of being on the list before we issued the formal notice. As a result of that administrative notice that went out, we were able to remove those 60. So they never had to actually file an appeal. We did it more proactively on an administrative basis because when the prior building official left and we were reviewing the information, there was that concern expressed, and so we thought it would be prudent to do that.
And can you tell us about the Fire Life Safety Commission?
Chris, do you want to talk to them about? I mean, I can give you a general overview, but I think you've worked with them a little more.
Yes, we have the Fire Life Safety Commission, which deals with all the appeal made to a building and safety, like a modification request we make or any kind of interpretation of code. Applicant can appeal to the board, and board also here's the, as you mentioned, the appeals related to seismic retrofit program. We had, since we launched the program, evaluated quite a number of structural analysis from architect and engineer stating and proving that their building should not be on the list. So the two engineers under building safety have been reviewing it and responded to those kind of structural analysis report. And so far, we have not had any appeal requests.
And then those that are trying to figure out what information they need to provide, is that just a matter of going to the counter and?
They, what they do is provide their permit record. Sometimes, for whatever reason, we do not have a record, but owner has a record. Sometimes it's a seismic retrofit, not the seismic retrofit work, but simple repair. And owner misunderstood as full retrofit work was done. So those cases we identify and let them know it was just a repair work and not the retrofit. And there's a time when owner had a permit and plans, but it was never inspected. And those cases, you know, we look into more detail. Sometimes the inspector goes out and verify and make a ruling.
But the information that you need in order to, you're saying all the property owner needs to do is provide the property record, and then you guys delve into your own records about the property.
Report has to be prepared by a licensed person, either a licensed civil engineer, structural, or licensed architect.
Thank you.
Mario.
Yeah, I have a number of questions. The way I read it, we've been in operation for 6 months now since the ordinance came out. Is this working? Is this one working? Is this working? Okay, sorry about that. So we've been 6 months since the ordinance came out. We've had 460 odd notices going out. What kind of response are we getting?
The response is pretty good. We had received, I say last month, we received like 3 dozen soft story retrofit plans were actually submitted. For those notices we sent out.
These are 36 that are people who have said, okay, we need to retrofit our building, and they're going about getting a building permit to do that? Is
Well,
that
people who, owners who do not have an issue with the notice,
I
they
see.
can go ahead and prepare a structural plan and actual retrofit plans and calculation. But those who wants to prove that those the building should not be in the list, they had a different type of proof to make, and we had received just I came on board 2 weeks ago. Since then, I've seen about 8 plans, structural analysis submitted for requesting to reconsider.
I see.
And I wanted to add one more thing. So one of the things also that we've done is that if a building owner, even if they have not been, well, I'll go back. If a building owner has been noticed and they are interested in just moving forward with their retrofit, we will accept their plan check in lieu of the structural analysis because they've already acknowledged that they're willing to do that. So as long as they get their plan check request in by the date of the notice or request an extension, get that plan check permit application in, we'll accept that plan check in lieu of the structural analysis, because it accomplishes the same thing and it moves it along faster. And in the case of someone who indicates that they just simply want to do the retrofit, they don't have to wait for the notice. They can simply move forward with that. And we'll track those appropriately to show that they've already complied with those initial deadlines.
Okay, so now you're talking to my favorite topic, which is speed. You know, we're 20 years since 94, 23 years. Unfortunately, we haven't been very good at pushing this thing ahead. And now we're climbing a very steep mountain at a time when construction costs are going through the roof. And this is when the city says, surprise, I want you to retrofit your building. So I'm thinking of all the things that we can do to facilitate this. We cannot control the cost of construction. We cannot control the cost of financing. But we can control the speed of approval. And I think the best way to get rid of the impediments to approval is to try to reduce the approval process to the one person that should be concerned with this, the structural plan checker. And we've had conversations about this in the sense that, yes, it's great to have 1,000 people sign off like we do normally, but all that takes time and adds the cost to the users, where their money should actually be going into the retrofit. I'd like you to speak to that, is what can we do to facilitate, accelerate, and eliminate, Public Works has to sign off, Fire Department has to sign. Each one of these things takes time, each one of these things slows down the process, and somebody else is going to pay with their life or their building down the road that last moment before the earthquake hits. Someone's not going to be ready. So can you address the issue of speeding things up?
Sure. In reviewing the majority number of retrofit projects, Soft Story, for example, even though we would require an approval from planning, transportation, and public work like other projects, but once reviewer get used to type of retrofit, it's very repeated and redundant project. So I agree that all those kind of clearance could be done over the counter. Also, what you mentioned about having one person or two person dedicated for the retrofit work, we agree. In looking at other larger city handling retrofit project like City of LA, San Francisco, they have so many staff they can afford to have, and even those cities have separate section just dealing with retrofit review. And yes, we are planning to have one or two person dedicated for reviewing all those retrofit work.
Yeah, what we're trying to do is avoid the train wreck that at year 2.9, all of a sudden 1,800 people show up and say, where's my retrofit? So anything we can do to stimulate a regular application process would be very desirable.
So if I could add one more thing, one of the other things is that we are contracting with outside agencies also to assist us. So if we see a surge in applications, we will have resources. In fact, we have them in place now on a preliminary basis, and we're going through a more formal RFP process. And so we will have that, or we do have that extra capacity built in so that we can, if we see that our workload is increasing, we can get help pretty quickly and pretty easily. The one area where I think we're having the biggest challenges for some of the more complicated structures, we still have not found a third party that can assist us with that part, but that's something that we are looking at.
So one thing I'd like to see is that we design an approval process, an upgrade process, that is identical to what we would do right after the earthquake. Right after the earthquake, we would be signing permits as fast as we can. There would be no chasing around to Public Works, no going over the trash people. Trash people are going to be overwhelmed just keeping the streets clean. And so I'd like to almost reverse engineer it. Can we design an approval process that looks like what we would do after the big quake, and therefore we have a higher probability of being ready for the big quake because it would be extremely fast.
We haven't really established the goal, but what we have in mind is, again, case of soft story, which is like 80% of the all soft story project. We don't think it would take a week or even 2 weeks, even on larger scale soft story design. It would be more like 3 days turnaround. That's what we
Can we get that in writing? That would be wonderful. 3 days turnaround is an architect's dream.
Matter of fact, I had seen that on writing that today.
Yeah, for the soft stories, we believe that that's something we can commit to because, unless there's something unusual about the building or if they're planning to do other work outside of the retrofit, our plan checkers are very confident that that is something that we can do, and we would view that as what we traditionally call an over-the-counter permit, meaning that you don't have to go through E-plans in order to get that done. You can submit it through a paper process, have that reviewed, and within a few days, within 3 business days, typically have the permit ready in hand.
Great. So let me ask you a few more things. So one of the issues that will inevitably come up with any retrofit is some portion of the building, and I'll use this example and you'll understand right away. I have a building that's 5 feet from the side property line. I need to put some plywood on that building. Now that building is 4.9 feet from the property line, so to speak. But the original setback was fine at 5 feet. Now I'm increasing it less than what was originally approved, and probably the current setback is 7 feet. So I'm actually making it more unencroaching. That should be something that the plan checker, the structural plan checker, should be able to sign off without going to David Martin and everybody else saying, oh, you can get this, but you have to sign and fill out the minor mod application, ka-chink, 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 days go by, David's on vacation, good things for him, but inevitably the more people touch it, the slower it gets, and we're racing the clock. We're already 20 years behind, because I'm glad we're having enforcement, but we need to match it with some intensity, some kind of real simplification here.
So, I'm just going to address the sort of planning side of that. I don't think as a concept, we have objection to that. However, it's not in the current ordinance. So, if there was interest in doing that, that would need to be brought forward as an ordinance amendment to allow that kind of a process to play out. Council would need to authorize.
Would this be an amendment to the zoning code or to the specific ordinance?
It would be, I think there's a few ways we could approach it. I mean, it could be, I'm not sure amending the zoning code, given the program kind of, I think, had its own specific ordinance, and so we could probably go about it that way, so it's more of a time-limited, special purpose kind of thing.
It takes all of us up here to answer these questions. But yeah, to Jing's point, the ordinance was adopted, and there are some exceptions in that ordinance already that allow us to move things through more quickly. I think the setback issue, though, is not specifically addressed. Yeah.
Okay.
So we would have to go back to council with that.
Last question. In the current ordinance, we're supposed to design to the 2016 code discounted by 75%. Is that accurate? Is that your understanding of it? That's the way I read it, but.
Correct. We very similar to LA city requirement. Yes, the base share value would be reduced to 75%. Yes.
Okay. So then when we're looking at 6 through 20-year timelines, 20 years from now, would we still be designing to the 1976 UBC discounted 25%? What happens? How does the the ordinance
stay with this code requirement will stay for during the duration of time? Yes.
And in your opinion, as a building official, is that a desirable state to discount 20 years of technological and earthquake science? And is that
technology? Will change obviously in
Right.
1 year, 5 years. I'm pretty sure, but it is what we could offer for existing building, which are quite dangerous as of today, and based on requirement and we impose them, it is best we could do. Obviously, if we put too much requirement onto existing building, it would make retrofit almost impossible.
Well, but also, if there was the idea that the standards might increase, it would speed up the adoption and the process of getting retrofitted. If you knew that in 2020, we would be designing to 2016 minus 25%. See where I'm going with this?
Yeah,
My interest is speed.
Sure, yeah, Commissioner, I understand, and I think every time we have a major earthquake, and locally, Southern California Structural Engineering Association, they get together, they study, evaluate, and come up with a new engineering requirement. And I can rule out within a few years from now, and if there's a very breakthrough technology came out, then there's a consideration that staff can get together. If it's that much significant, something we may consider, yes.
If I could make one comment about that. So I think that from the industry standpoint and building owner standpoint, it's all going to come down to cost. So I think if new technologies come around that allow for the cost to come down, I certainly think that industry will adopt that very quickly, and there won't be resistance to making those changes. I think that cost is always the big issue for folks in terms of complying. And I think that with regards to changing standards, again, it's a balancing act, like Chris is saying, it's a balancing act that we're trying to do in terms of saying, we need you to do this. The standard that we are applying is life safety, not saving the building.
Sure.
So at the end of the day, the building may not be savable. It may get condemned, even with these standards. The idea is to ensure that the people are able to walk out of that building alive.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Hi. A couple of things. During your presentation, you spoke about, you went over the non-compliance monitoring. Can you explain that again, just real briefly, and say, is that something that the rent control agency could also have access to?
They do have access to it, so I mean, we share with them any information that they ask for, and the complete database that we have, we've shared with them, which I think they used for their most recent meeting as well in terms of identifying which buildings are on the list. But within our system, we have a system that we use to track permits and to track code cases and a whole variety of things, and it's called Accela. And so within that system, we've created a new...
Tell me the name again of what it's called.
It's called Accela.
Accela, thank you.
A-C-C-E-L-A.
Okay.
And we've created a new code case for it. And so every single building that was placed on the list was given a code case number, which in the screenshot that I showed you, you could see the little case number that it had. Within that, we have a workflow within that for each case. So what the workflow does is it shows every single step that case is supposed to go through, from noticing all the way to compliance. And so at any point in time, we can issue a report that will show what the status is of every building that was originally placed on the list, whether it has been noticed or whether it has completed whatever step it needs to take. If in fact a deadline has passed, because if there is a deadline, say January 31st, 2020, for them to have obtained their permits, because that's one of the additional codified deadlines, then if they don't do that, then we would refer those to code enforcement for any enforcement action that they might take. So they would then issue a notice to the person saying, you have failed to comply, you need to comply, otherwise there may be some additional steps that are taken. If they ignore that notice, then at that point citations could be issued. If they continue to ignore that notice, their case could be referred to the city attorney's office for prosecution, and so that's how they would carry out their normal enforcement steps.
I see, okay, thank you.
Did that answer?
And then my next question is about following up on Commissioner Fonda-Minardi's comments. I don't know if it was today or last evening. Commissioner Fonda-Minardi shared with the other commissioners like an outline that kind of he said he wanted to share with us for our discussion today, and it kind of I guess what he spoke about already was a synopsis of what he's presented to the commissioners in this outline. And I guess the outline's probably up on the table, available for others if they want to see it, since we have it. And if not, I hope it can be made available. But I want to address the idea of having, one person expediting these the permits, because, and I'll just take a look at the outline that he presented, which maybe we're going to discuss after we do questions and answers. The concept of having the building department plan checker having the ability to grant by right to the applicant any alterations to the current standards, like we were talking about, for example, the setbacks. But as I was thinking about that idea, I'm wondering how that, I'm thinking specifically in terms of rent-controlled properties. I'm not sure if that creates a blurry line between what is really necessary for the seismic retrofit and what could potentially be some other kind of work. And it's my understanding that when you spoke with the rent control agency, they're operating under the understanding that seismic retrofitting necessities are going to be completely separate from any other type of building, or maintenance, permits for any other type of project. So if it's not related to the seismic issue, it has to be completely separate. And so I'm a little bit, first of all, is that the case? You're planning on doing that already? Because to me that seems like you might get a little bit of overlap. How would you address that?
Yeah, I think I understand your question. So if a building owner is going to submit to do a retrofit in conjunction with other work,
Yeah.
right, then none of the exemptions that were outlined apply to them. So they must comply with everything as if they're just doing a regular construction project. So I don't know if that's
Any kind of expediting that we're talking about here would definitely not apply to something like that.
It would not, because in those cases we don't know what the scope of work is going to be in those cases, and we don't know how invasive it will be. If they're replacing all of the plumbing in the building, then that's a very specific issue, and it could be very invasive. It could have a lot of impacts on tenants. It could be very disruptive, and so we aren't really in a position to guarantee that we can expedite that project just because they also happen to be doing a retrofit. And we see that pretty regularly, where they do a lot of other work and then they do the retrofit as part of it.
I think their project can kind of be in a gray line area where you have some retrofit once you trying to do a retrofit work and open up, and there are things that you want to do it a little differently or cover up with different finish material.
Right.
I think that should be considered as a part of a retrofit work. But I think what sell more, if there's a work not related to the original retrofit work, like even small size addition or extensive remodel on other part of the building that is not related to retrofit, should be considered differently.
So in a situation like that, is that a situation where you would also again reach out to the rent control agency to let them know that gray area has been kind of, so right now I know that the rent control agency signs off on permits, they do it very rapidly, and it's kind of a courtesy. Essentially, do you have plans on stopping that?
No, we notify
continue?
whenever there is a building. We've recently been implementing, because one of the other areas that I'm working on in terms of a program is the tenant protection programs. And so one of the things that we've done recently is to establish a tracking system so that when there are tenants in a building, it gets flagged in that application. So for that property, it will get flagged that there are tenants, and as such, there is a means and methods required. and rent control is notified of every single one of those applications that comes through, so they're aware if it's a rent control building and there is work going to be done, then they are aware of that. Does that answer your question?
And so in the scenario that we just, that Mr. Lee brought up really briefly, you know, they start doing something and they realize that maybe something here needs to change, and, you know, maybe, is that something that, so even though the initial permit and the means and methods has already been distributed and perhaps even agreed to, as something, if something changes along the way, that's something that owners and the agency and tenants will still know about as it goes on? Is that part of the plan?
Yes. Again, we're trying to beef up our tenant protection rules because there's two types of issues that take place. One is what we refer to more as a reactive issue, where there's an unexpected incident occurs. So either there's infrastructure failure, or in some cases we've had where an electrical box blows up and literally catches the building on fire, things along those lines, and it causes tenants to be displaced because of those kinds of issues and to be impacted. That's one type of program.
Right.
What we're looking at, you know, and that tends to work, you know, fairly well. Where we seem to have problems is when there's a construction project and it tends to be a new owner, it tends to be a relatively high number of vacant units, and these are new owners coming in to try to renovate, to improve the building, and try, you know, obviously to have a return. And so we find that in those situations, we are trying to, because we've seen far more of that lately, we're trying to monitor those sites more carefully. We've hired a neighborhood preservation coordinator, and she is assisting with trying to figure out kind of where are there holes in the process, how do we fill those holes in the process, and has actually developed a proposal that we are currently in the process of vetting, that we are planning to take to council hopefully in February, and that will address, you know, more monitoring for these kinds of units. We also just signed a contract, in fact, Rick Cole, our city manager, just signed it today, with a third party that will allow us to have on-site monitoring, periodic monitoring of sites where there are tenants present. If we think that the scope of work is large, then we will have that third party will do unannounced inspections to make sure they're complying with the means and methods, and making sure that the conditions are acceptable.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. And thanks for letting us know about that.
Sure.
That's all the questions I have for right now. Thank you.
Do you want to know? I have a couple, not too many. Sorry. I'm sorry, I can't see. Will the monitoring program that is, I know you have this special computer program to keep track of it all, but it sounds like you're using your existing code enforcement staff, you said in the presentation. I'm wondering how that's going to impact other general code enforcement, which we as a commission hear a lot from people, why aren't you enforcing this or that? So is that staff going to be more put out, and are we going to have a greater gap of enforcement in other areas?
Well, it's hard to say because we don't know how much non-compliance we'll have at this point. I think that when it comes to code enforcement, David can attest that it is it's a peak and valley kind of situation, and issues change routinely. So, you know, we have various issues that come up from time to time. We get them calmed down, and then we have to focus on something else, and then sometimes that issue will come back up again. So it's always a matter of balancing resources. I think that if, in fact, we were to find ourselves in a situation where if we were to find ourselves in a situation where we felt that it was necessary, we would certainly, you know, look at what our staffing levels are. I think that I'll just be completely honest and say that it is. We try very hard not to add staff if we can avoid it, because it's very expensive to add staff, and it's a very long-term commitment to add staff, which is why we, for example, with the monitoring and with the, if we get a large number of plan checks, we can utilize third parties, because it can help us deal with some of those ebbs and flows without making this massive large-term investment that, we don't necessarily want to have to do if we can avoid doing that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so basically you're saying that some of this third-party contract work could help alleviate some of that stress too?
It's possible, yeah, because like, for example, the on-site monitoring, that will relieve some of the enforcement stuff, like with regards to tenants, issues. And certainly I think that if there are opportunities to do that and to get assistance, if it makes sense, sometimes it makes sense to hire somebody, right? It just, like, for example, when we hired the neighborhood preservation coordinator, it makes sense to hire a person sometimes. But we do try to see what all of our options are.
Okay. So then my next question has to do with the HRI properties that are potentially landmarkable and have some sort of historic value, and how those are flagged. And in combination with that, you had said at some point, in answer to some other question, that this new Fire Life Safety Commission will be looking at exceptions to codes that have to do with life safety, which also brings up the idea of the State Historic Building Code, which may also come into how they seismically retrofit their buildings, and they might need to find alternative approaches to doing these things so that they don't strip off those finishes that you were referring to in order to get in, and they might need to find different ways. So are you sure that the people who are hired are trained and aware of these programs and laws and ordinances that can work with that?
I think I understand your question.
I know, I was saying a lot of different things.
So when it comes to whether or not we can, and Chris may be able to speak a little more to this, if there are innovative or different ways of dealing with things, we do have an alternative means and methods process that we can utilize. That does require certain conditions be met in terms of equivalency, but certainly Chris, as the building officer, does have that discretion. Now, again, in any of those kinds of cases, it takes longer because there's much more vetting that has to happen to ensure that that it does meet the standards that we're looking for, and sometimes it's just a longer process to come to that.
Right, but one thing that's really an issue with historic preservation in Santa Monica and everywhere is that when particularly these kinds of technical engineering kinds of things come on the table, owners don't necessarily know that there is an alternative process that they could ask for. And when the officer says, nope, you got to rip off all that outside and you got to put in a new shear wall, they're going to say, oh, well, so much for my historic property. And they really need to be told up front, well, this is how we would do it, but I see you have a historic property, and let's try to figure out an alternative way to do it so that you don't do that. And that's something that I think.
Staff are well aware of state historical code, and we'll make sure that we enforce the code
Right.
to the
But
language.
offered, not just waiting for the owner to know that it's out there, because an HRI owner isn't going to know about that stuff necessarily.
Well, I'll make 2 points. One is that all those buildings are flagged in our system, and so they know. And Jane, correct me if I'm wrong, but all those have to go. They get looked at by planning in terms of any additional requirements that those particular structures will need, or.
I think we don't want to muddy the waters between an HRI and a landmark property, obviously.
Right.
There's.
Well, HRI is still.
Right,
access
yeah,
to the
and,
code.
we've had this discussion as to, for landmark properties, obviously, there's a real, regulatory structure around it. For the HRIs, I think that's part of the thinking, as we're balancing the need to be speedy and that sort of thing, where it's involving an exterior change, to a potential historic resource, when we want to think through the ramifications of that. So the ordinance, I think did, that was discussed, when the ordinance was adopted, but obviously that's something that we're very mindful of. I think if I'm understanding correctly, I think in the most cases, I think in the 94 quake, when there were a lot of the soft story retrofits that occurred, most of the work actually occurred interior. And I think city planning actually did do like ARB staff approval, sort of staff approval stuff where things were changed on the outside. But that was, that's historically speaking. And again, if there's a desire move forward, but also protect, that's sort of the
Mhm.
thing that, we can look at further as a staff.
Right. It's a policy thing, really, and not,
Right, so, and I'll make one more comment about that, in that the plan checkers will never tell someone that they have to strip something, right? I mean, they're not going to design or tell them how to do something. Well, they're going to look at the compliance aspects of it to say, this is what you must comply with. How they get there is really going to be up to the designer. That's something that there's always a little tension about that with regards to plan checks sometimes, but that is something that.
And one good example would be, in case of a soft story, sometimes the downstairs wall need to be beefed up, meaning a new shear wall has to be put on, and option is they could put it outside or they could do inside. And as long as the value is there, step will be okay. It's up to a designer or the owner to put it whether outside or inside.
okay. Thank you. I think you answered that. Sorry, I had one other. That's it. We have two chits. Thank you. I think everyone asked their questions.
Yeah,
Thank you. Oh,
more
wait,
question.
Mario has one.
One more question. Does Excella track if a property is on the HRI or a landmarked? Does that appear as a tag with all the other data on that project?
Landmark for sure, HRI as well, right? Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, beautiful. We have two speakers for this item, Carol Lemline and Anastasia Foster.
I'm Carol Lemline. Most of what I wanted to speak to was already covered by Nina in her questions about HRI properties. But I want to point out that when this was presented to the Landmarks Commission, the commission asked about this and why it wasn't more explicitly flagged, and they were told that it was any competent engineer or designer or architect would know about this. And I think that given the level of education of property owners and such people in the city, it behooves us to be somewhat more proactive about it, although I'm not anxious to slow down the process by imposing additional requirements. Thank you.
You're Anastasia?
Hi, I'm Anastasia Foster. I'm an elected commissioner on the Rent Control Board. And when I saw this on the agenda, I just wanted to come and offer just a couple quick thoughts. And if you happen to have any questions, not that I presume you do, but if you did, I'd be happy to try to answer them for you. First of all, let me say in regards to permit history or what might have been done after 1994, there have been some rumors on the internet and whatever that the city has lost all the permits or lost a bunch of the records of prior work that had been done. If that is the case, or if an owner is having trouble locating their record, the Rent Control Board also has a very extensive microfiche, I think it even is, database of actual receipts, plans, permits, completed work done, if in fact they had tenants in the building at the time. So in that particular instance, and much as planning and buildings share information with us, we'd be happy to share that information with you if you were to have a client who did not have access to their information. I would note that we, as a city, are 3 years behind some other cities. Berkeley's already been at this for 3 years, and we're a year ahead of some others who are still putting it on their agendas. So we applaud the city for moving forward quickly with it, and I echo your sentiments about speed and everything we can do for public safety and to move and streamline and provide efficiencies where it makes sense. But I would note that as an individual Rent Control Board commissioner and as an agency and as a charter, we are committed to tenant protections and landlord protections where applicable and where it makes sense. And in this case, the means and methods plan, we've worked numerous different angles and ordinances with the city, with building and code enforcement and planning to make certain that the means and methods plan continues to be more robust and stronger than it has been. As construction trends change, real estate investment trends change, we are keeping up as best we can with the exact cases and scenarios as they come to us. Not an outlier here or there, but when we see 10 and 20 and 30 cases of similar construction, perhaps taking too long, being overly invasive, perhaps and perhaps not, designed to move tenants along who don't want to accept a buyout, for instance, or don't want to relocate. These protections are there to protect everybody who has the right to stay in their controlled tenancy. So the means and methods part of this, we don't want to see anything, I don't want to see anything that supersedes that or that shortcuts that in any way, but it sounds like Sal and his department are well aware and very cooperative with our department in sharing information about that, and as long as that's respected, we would have no problem with efficiencies and improvements to the process. And lastly, you've all touched on it, but I just wanted to reiterate strong position that no other projects be lumped into any permitting designed for seismic retrofit. The Rent Control Board only has the ability to protect tenants from overwrought construction, too long of a timetable, or high impacts on people who are living in the building if they're separate. Because we will not be granting rent decrease for construction for anything related directly to seismic retrofit repairs because it's mandatory. Anything else that's by choice or that's a regular part of a maintenance repair would and should be handled like any other repair or permit issued by the city. And that's all I wanted to say. We applaud you and your commission and your agency for your work and for always your continued cooperation. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer it. Otherwise, that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Oh, question.
So when a project comes to you from the building department requiring tenant protection mitigations, means and methods, is there a standardized form that everyone understands, oh, we're going to need this kind of plastic, we're going to need this kind of relocation, or is it cooked up case by case?
So it's probably not entirely accurate to say that it comes to us per se. Mm-hmm. It's more of a city public information, public record exchange, and Sal described it very accurately. They make us aware. Now, when it comes to a typical construction decrease, we recently amended our regulations to where if a building owner wants to proactively change all the windows out or completely dismantle the landscaping and start over or whatever it may be, those come to us and we check the scope. And in that case, we keep a close eye on if a tenant needs to be relocated or not, how extensive the means and methods plan is, if it's robust enough, we take a look at it. And then we advise, if necessary, we advise the tenants of their rights, and then it would be up to each individual tenant to bring a rent decrease petition. We don't supply it for them, we don't implement it for them. They still, as a citizen, have to come and do it themselves. In the case of seismic retrofit, we are carefully monitoring through their process, is it being done in a timely fashion? And is the scope of the project, does it make sense for what the projected repair is? And I might note that there have been some fears in the landlord community of the cost. And we are still, as you said, we are still debating this. We've had one entire session of public comment and commissioner discussion, and we're having another one this coming month. I would note that the cost of Ellising a building, for instance, if one did not want to tackle the repairs, is upwards of $10,000 to $20,000 per unit in relocation benefits to each tenant, which far surpasses by a multiple of 3 or more any per unit cost for the retrofit. So we don't particularly fear that as a common reaction to seismic retrofit, however it's dealt with on the financial end. I think that's the best I can do to answer your question.
And what would be a typical turnaround time? Right now when you submit something that says, you have to get a sign-off by rent control. What's a typical?
Again, it's
turnaround?
not a sign-off. It's not a sign-off.
Well, it has been in some of my plans. I've had to get rent control sign-off, so.
Well, and Sal can probably help me answer that. It's not a sign-off for seismic retrofit. If there are tenants in place, the means and methods plan involves us as far as an enforcement mechanism, but means and methods is by city, by the city council, and by building and safety and code enforcement. It's not ours per se. However, we informed the discussion to form it and its standards. And if and when, if a seismic retrofit project would be going beyond scope or too invasive or taking too long, then and only then could we impose rent decreases. That's the only thing we have power over, is a rent decrease or increase. That's it, in regards to construction. So the power of the purse is really the only control and participation the Rent Control Board has in this, other than constantly, making our opinions known about tenant protections and working with other city agencies.
Okay, thank you.
Can I clarify?
Sure.
So, in the planning process for entitlements, I think there may be a rent control component to that. But in the construction for building permits, rent control doesn't sign off on anything. We simply notify them of any particular properties. The means and methods is actually reviewed by building and safety. Now, in some cases, if there are disputes, I know that there's been negotiations and there's been measures that have been agreed to in terms of how you will conduct certain construction and things along those lines, but that's all part of the rent control process. And I know that that's happened a number of times where owners and the Rent Control Board negotiate terms for how that construction will take place. That's separate from the means and methods. The means and methods is a more proactive sort of, we're trying to establish mitigation measures up front. Typically, if it gets to rent control, usually things have fallen apart, right? Things aren't going well if it gets to that point.
Oh, wait, there's one more.
Actually, my question was just, and you may or may not have the answer, but is it your experience as a Rent Control Board member that with the Rent Control Agency, your cooperation between the two departments is, and all the necessary departments, but building and safety, code compliance, that the inspectors and others, everyone is knowledgeable about the rent control law, and the information is available so that as things arise, they know to reach out? Or is the agency available to share information if possible or necessary?
We've always had a very good relationship with the other entities, and as a reminder, we are completely separate, completely and totally and wholly separate from the city. We are self-funded equally 50-50 by landlords and tenants. So we don't office with the city, we don't share resources with the city in any way, shape, or form. That being said, when we recently amended Regulation 4400 as it pertains to voluntary construction projects, elected construction projects, the city came and gave wonderful presentations. Our agencies worked together very well. We helped inform the discussion about procuring a neighborhood preservation coordinator. And since that person has come on board, they've come to present a couple of times. We have a robust and healthy relationship between our executive director and her staff and the other staffs in town. And we absolutely are happy to share any knowledge and database information we may have at any time.
That's really great to hear, because I know that over the course of the past few years, everyone's been talking about improving communication and working more closely together. So to hear that happening is great.
The only caveat I would add would be that if a particular, in our department we call them information analysts. I don't know what they would call somebody that they reach on the phone, for instance, with a quick question at building or planning or code. But I cannot vouch for the fact that every single member of their entire staff knows everything about means and methods plans or knows everything about rent control tenants. But I'm confident that any questions they would have, their supervisors would know that they could quickly reach out to
And you're available for that.
our agency.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. So that closes the public part of our thing. Does anybody else have anything else to say on this topic? Or are we ready to move on? All right.
I found it
Well,
very informative. Thanks for putting it on the agenda.
Thank you very much. I think it's going to be amazing not to have buildings fall on our heads. So our next item on our agenda is 1430 Lincoln Boulevard, Development Agreement Review, 15 ENT-0266. I guess we should move out of the blinding light for the staff report.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Paul Foley, Principal Planner with the City Planning Division. This is the second of the downtown DAs at 1430 Lincoln Boulevard that are related to the 1337 7th Street property exchange with the city so that we can build a new fire station number 1. The site is on the west side of Lincoln Boulevard between Santa Monica and Broadway, in the LT Lincoln Transition West District of the Downtown Community Plan. The development site is 30,000 square feet and currently contains a surface parking lot. Surrounding properties are zoned NV Neighborhood Village and LT Lincoln Transition West in the DCP. The photo above here shows the buildings that previously existed on the site. The site is now used as a surface parking lot in conjunction with the parking easements mentioned in the DA staff reports and is authorized by CUP in April of 2016. The project is a mixed-use project, 67,470 square feet with 100 residential units, 5,878 square feet of ground floor commercial space, 1,394 square foot front plaza. There's a 4-level subterranean parking garage with 296 parking spaces, 155 long-term and 22 short-term bike spaces, and 61 EV charging stations. As a Tier 2 project, much like 1325 6th Street, the proposed development could today be approved with an administrative approval under the DCP because the project is under 75,000 square feet. The applicant, however, has proposed a development agreement due to the excess parking spaces proposed on site that will serve to permanently replace parking spaces that are currently obligated, as we saw on 6th Street, by a parking easement at 1377 7th Street. And as I said, this is part of the property exchange for the fire station number 1. In addition, recently the applicant has asked for an extension of the conditional use permits for the surface parking. As the condition may remember, conditional use permits 16 ENT 0012 and 0013 were approved on April 6, 2016 that authorized temporary surface parking lots at 1318 and 1430 Lincoln Boulevard respectively. At that time, it was anticipated that the DA hearings would occur in the fall of 2016 and that construction of 1430 Lincoln would commence by the end of 2018 and conclude and be constructed by mid-2022. Therefore, the CUP for parking at that site was due to expire in December of 2018, and the CUP for parking at 1318 Lincoln was due to expire in July 2022, when the parking spaces would permanently move to 1430 Lincoln. However, since the DA hearings are occurring now, the applicant has requested a 1-year extension of the parking rights granted by the 2 CUPs to 2019 and 2023. As you can see on the slide, the building is set back 10 feet along the frontage, 20 feet is curb to building. As I said before, there's 5,878 square feet of commercial area, 1,394 square feet of front plaza on the ground floor, 3,800 square feet of common open space, 1,101 square feet of private open space, a residential lobby and package room, long-term and short-term bike parking, 4 one-bedroom units, 2 two-bedroom units, 2 three-bedroom units, and vehicle access is from 7th Court. On the roof, there is a 2,649 square foot roof deck with spa, a 3,201 square foot mechanical area for HVAC, and approximately 2,000 square feet for photovoltaic panels. The Architecture Review Board had their concept review on April 4th, 2016. The design was generally well received by the ARB. The board noted that the integration of the commercial and residential entrances along the front of the building was done well and offered the following comments. that the 3 design elements were well broken up. The building masses on either side of the ground floor plaza were not compatible. With respect to the building design, the secondary elevations were not as asymmetrical as the front. They wanted to ensure the feasibility of the canopy element. With respect to open space, the courtyard should cut through the building. The ground floor pedestrian orientation, the ground floor ceiling height pinches at the midpoint of the elevation. In respect to the ground floor units, they should be secured and assured of light and air. Here we go. The Planning Commission conducted their float up on April 20th, 2016. And with respect to their comments, in terms of design, building in mass and scale, the scale of the building worked well along Lincoln Boulevard, they thought. The materiality, different finishes on the top 2 building masses were not necessary, and the concept should be revisited so they would better work together. Bicycle storage, the residential bicycle storage should be located on the ground floor. The ground floor rear units should be reconsidered with respect to light, air, visibility, and security. And many small retail openings are encouraged on the ground floor street and ground floor plaza, and they should be secured. With respect to the responses to these comments from the ARB and the Commission, with respect to building mass and scale, changes to the front elevation were introduced, maintaining the massing differentiation. The north elevation was redesigned to increase the size of the side yard courtyard. With respect to building design, the alley elevation has been improved to reflect the asymmetrical forms and architectural concept of the Lincoln elevation. Materiality, the facade material of the south volume was changed to match the material of the north volume. With respect to open space, ground floor courtyard and front plaza extend from the front to the rear of the building and is open to the sky and breaks up the front building's facade. The second floor courtyard is located near the southwest corner of the building and enhances the private open space of the 3 units. The third floor courtyard is longitudinal in nature and extends roughly north and south. The fifth floor courtyard or terrace is located along the Lincoln Boulevard frontage and is envisioned as an outdoor living room. With respect to the livability and security of the ground floor units, the layout of the ground floor units was revised to maximize light and air. Security is also provided from Lincoln Boulevard and from the alley. Pedestrian orientation, the yellow box frame on the Lincoln elevation was revised to increase the clearance height, thereby reducing the pinch point in perception of the building mass. 2 commercial spaces offer 4 access doors, each to allow flexibility for future tenant spaces. The side entrances facing the entry walkway were added as a way to connect both commercial spaces with the front plaza. In respect to bicycle storage, 10% of the required long-term parking racks are now located at the ground floor level. The remaining 90% of the long-term spaces are located in direct proximity to the elevator on P1 parking level. Oops. There we go. There we go. Additional comments from the Planning Commission. The Commission wanted to see enhance the TDM plan. They wanted to achieve LEED Platinum. They wanted to maximize the number of rooftop PV panels. They wanted to explore rent stabilization from market rate units, increased number of EV parking spaces, and the 14% enhanced fees consistent with Tier 2 project. In terms of general comments, the commercial tenancies, an attempt should be made to replace the same number of commercial spaces being displaced as a result of the project. And also they recommended management for social services for senior units at 711 Colorado. The project does propose enhanced parking, recreation, and transportation impact fees of 14%, and enhanced TDM. They are proposing LEED Platinum, and they're maximizing the rooftop photovoltaic panels. The ground floor may accommodate 4 commercial spaces, which is the same number as those displaced. The number of EV parking spaces are increased to 61, and 711 Colorado is included in the DA and has included an on-site social service management program. Design and massing. The proposed height of the building is 50 feet, which is consistent with Tier 2 limits established for the Lincoln Transition West District of the DCP, which allows up to 60 feet. The building facade is modulated at the ground level with the 2 building masses separated by a 58-foot wide pedestrian plaza. The ground floor commercial spaces measure approximately 126 feet, 59 feet, and 67 feet for the north and south spaces respectively, which equate to a total of about 63% of the ground floor street frontage. Upper level building frontage provides a significant amount of modulation with varying upper level step backs and architectural features. An outdoor terrace measuring about 58 feet wide is located on the 5th floor at the building frontage to provide additional relief from building mass at the upper levels. The DCP regulates massing by requiring a percentage of the upper level building facade to be modulated, and the proposed design complies with these requirements. The proposed building design is modern and contemporary with high levels of glazing and transparency along the ground floor. The building is set back to provide additional open space on the ground floor, resulting in a minimum sidewalk width of 20 feet curb to building, consistent with the sidewalk width standards of the DCP. The 20-foot wide public sidewalk would primarily serve as pedestrian circulation area, but also provides opportunities for short-term bike parking, landscaping, gathering spaces, and outdoor seating. The entire ground floor frontage is set back a minimum of 20 feet from the curb, as I said, and would serve as a pedestrian circulation area, short-term parking, landscaping, etc. The commercial space is can be divided up into 4 separate tenant spaces consistent with the Planning Commission direction. The ground floor design incorporates extensive glazing measuring approximately 14.5 feet in height, 4 commercial entrances, and the potential for seating areas in the ground floor plaza and the public sidewalk. With respect to off-street parking, we've had this similar conversation with 1325 6th. The project design includes a surplus of 269 parking spaces above the maximum permitted by the DCP in order to accommodate the project's functional requirements, public parking spaces, and the private parking easement at 1337 7th Street, which is the fire station space. Bicycle parking is consistent with DCP standards. Of the proposed 441 proposed non-easement spaces, 20 spaces are required to be available as non-exclusive shared parking on a first-come, first-served basis. And an additional 15 spaces are reserved for public parkings for the city use, which may be expanded to 30 spaces upon issuance of a certificate of occupancy for 1325 6th Street. This leaves 91 spaces that may be utilized for the on-street parking for on or off-site users. Affordable housing, as noted in the staff report, the project at 1325 6th that we saw 2 weeks ago and 1430 Lincoln will be fulfilling their affordable housing obligations and an affordable senior housing project located at 711 Colorado. As shown here on the slide, the 1430 Lincoln project will provide a total of 30 affordable units with 7 one-bedroom and 3 two-bedroom units to extremely low-income households and 10 studio and 10 one-bedroom units to moderate-income households. With respect to community benefits, they're required to provide at least 25% affordable housing units off-site per the DCP. As I mentioned before, the project is providing a total of 30% affordable units, 10 affordable units at 30% AMI, required by the DCP, or 10 are proposed, 15 affordable units at 100% AMI required by the DCP, and 20 proposed for a total of 30. The T2 unit mix standards limit studio units to a 15% total on the number of units, and 14 are proposed. Requires a minimum of 20% two-bedroom units, and 50% are proposed, and 50% three-bedroom units, and 15% is proposed, and an average bedroom factor of at least 1.2, and the project is proposing 1.37. With respect to community benefits, the enhanced impact fees for park and recreation and transportation impacts represent a 14% increase above the adopted fees for the incremental development above the Tier 1 project would be, consistent with the community benefits as required in Chapter 9.23 of the zoning ordinance and as previously directed in the project's Planning Commission float-up. No affordable housing commercial linkage fees required due to a credit for the previously existing commercial square footage that existed previously on site. This table shows you a difference between the Tier 1 fees and the enhanced Tier 2 14% fees. The proposed project is exempt from the revisions of the California Environmental Quality Act pursuant to Section 21155.1 of the CEQA guidelines, which exempts a special class of priority projects or otherwise known as TPPs. The attachment D of the staff report contains the CEQA exemption determination. The findings that are required for a development agreement require consistency of the general plan, compatibility with uses in the district, conformity with the public necessity and convenience, the project not detrimental to health, safety, and general welfare. The project will not negatively affect the orderly development of the property, and the project will have a positive fiscal impact on the city. DCP goal LU1 calls for housing for people across income spectrums, jobs, arts, culture, local serving retail, and gathering spaces. DCP goal LU4 calls for a range of housing opportunities, including affordable and family housing. This project will include 15 affordable units in close proximity to the future light rail transit and employment center within the downtown and 23 bedroom units. The proposed project is located in the NV district, which supports mixed-use development. The proposed project will develop an underutilized parcel with a project that is consistent with the DCP goals and objectives. And the project would provide monetary contributions that would support transportation, cultural arts, parks and recreation, early childhood initiatives, affordable housing, water conservation, and cultural arts programs in the city. Further, the ground floor commercial uses would generate city revenues, business license taxes for the city's general fund. Public notices were mailed to property owners and tenants within a 1,000-foot radius of the site. We received one comment from DTSM Inc., which was received by us, which was in support of the project. And with that, if there are any questions of staff or comments? You would? And we'll have to move this.
Before we have questions of staff, let's just quickly do any ex parte disclosures. Anybody? Nope. Okay, questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Does the downtown community plan have a different bump for tier 2 projects than the 14%? Didn't we adopt a bump to the transportation impact? Okay, but this project's not complying with.
No, the direction from the Plan Commission was to do the tier 2 14% enhanced fees.
Okay, but that direction was before DCP was adopted, right? Okay, that's all.
Any other questions? Okay, let's, oh, okay, sorry.
Which I ask all these projects. What percentage of the energy this building is required is going to be produced on site, I assume by the solar collectors?
I think it's in here. Hold on a second.
2,000 square feet seem pretty modest for a building this size.
I think it's in. Hold on a second. If I can. It would be 100% of the electricity needed for the project's common areas and excluding the elevators is what's required in the DA.
Okay.
Was the question about what they would be required to do versus
No,
what they're?
what they were actually
okay.
achieving with the solar collectors that they had on their roof. So, okay, thank you.
Any other questions, or shall we hear from the applicant? Okay. Mr. Rand.
Good evening, Commissioners. Dave Rand, Armbruster, Goldsmith, and Delvec. You're representing the applicant tonight. Good to be back with you for the second of these two projects related to the land exchange for the city fire station. We had an extensive discussion last time about the parking arrangements, the history with the settlement agreements, how these projects came to be. I'll spare you that tonight. I just want to make a couple of what I think are important distinctions about this particular project as compared to the project that you recommended approval for last time we met. The Lincoln project is being held to the downtown community plan standards in the staff report, or at least it's being compared to those standards. And that was certainly an appropriate comparison for 1325 6th Street. That was located in the portion of the downtown where there were no zoning ordinance standards that applied. This is different in that this project's on Lincoln Boulevard. When we proposed this project, this qualified as a tier 2 under the zoning ordinance because it is 50 feet and 2.25 FAR. The DCP today allows 60 feet and 2.75 FAR. So we're a full story and half a point of FAR below what's permitted in the DCP. So the direction from the Planning Commission to distinguish this project from 6th Street and focus on Tier 2 community benefits at that time was based on the fact that but for the surplus parking that serves the telephone building, this would have been a DRP. This would have been a Tier 2 DRP. It would have been grandfathered out from the DCP, and we would have proceeded on an entirely different track. And I really do believe that is a critical distinction from this project as compared to the other. Now, that being said, we've also heard your direction to up the community benefits, and we think we've done that. Notwithstanding the fact that Tier 2 DRP project would do 7.5% affordable, maybe 15%, very low. This project has 30%, 10% of which is dedicated to extremely low households at the 7-Eleven Colorado building. This project is LEED Platinum. This project has an enhanced TDM program. This project gives 30 of the surplus parking spaces to the city for public use. So this is I think, a very robust package of community benefits, given we're talking about a project that doesn't even hit the allowable development rights, achieve the allowable development rights under the downtown community plan. With respect to the design, this project is also distinguishable from 6th Street because the 6th Street project went through multiple iterations. It received pretty extensive feedback from you as it did from the ARB. This project's design has been embraced from day one. The ARB supported this project's design, as did you, and the fundamental design approach has stayed consistent all the way as a result from that. Now, it's been refined. There have been things that have been tweaked to meet ARB and Planning Commission direction, but fundamentally this design has always been supported, and the comments from you last time we were before you was that it was appropriately scaled, and the articulation and modulation was successful in terms of a building of this length at this location on Lincoln Boulevard. So with all that being said, we hope to have your approval tonight to move on to the next step for City Council. Normally we would have our architect, who's a very talented guy, give you a design presentation. John Reed is here tonight to answer your questions. He's suffering from a stomach flu, so I think with staff's extensive presentation, if it's okay with you, we'll just have him available for questions rather than make him come up and give a presentation. So with that, I thank you and happy to answer any questions, of course, that you may have.
Are there any questions? I have one design question. It was just a comment that, I'm sorry to make you stand up. It was just something that staff said that I'd read in the report about the yellow box being adjusted in some way to alleviate some pinching of some kind, and I couldn't tell. I have the plans we looked at last time. I didn't see any change. What is different about it?
Let me grab the plans real quick.
Thank you.
If you turn to sheet A7 on the new plans, we don't have any units on the second level. So originally we had units tucked in that area, and those units were removed.
Oh, okay. That was the pinch.
And the original portion of the presentation had the original scheme, and then at the end of the presentation had the new design, which showed the same metal fenestration on both wings versus on only one wing, and then the concrete on the other wing.
Okay. Thank you very much.
John Reed with the Reed Architectural Group.
Are there other questions for, no? Okay, then let's, yeah?
I have a question, but I'm not sure if it's maybe for staff or if it's for the applicant's attorney.
Well,
It's about the, oops, I just turned my page. It's about the 52 points.
Is it a quick one?
Yeah, it's a quick one. Okay, our staff report talks about the 52 points that's required for, to satisfy the requirements of the deed restriction, and any units at 7-Eleven Colorado in excess of that point threshold are rented at 100% AMI. Are those are considered the 100% AMI projects at 7-Eleven, or are they supposed to be someplace else?
No, that's all at 7-Eleven. So you're referring to the 7-Eleven Colorado deed restriction.
That's those, okay.
Right, and the 52 points is the minimum number of affordable points based on number of bedrooms and affordability level that need to be achieved at 7-Eleven Colorado per that deed restriction. This project far exceeds that, and the extremely low component in and of itself exceeds the 52 points. So we're doing more extremely low units than the 52 points by a significant factor, and then everything else is above and beyond that with regard to the moderate income units at the site.
I see, okay, thanks.
Thank you. We have one speaker, Zoe, and you get an extra minute from someone named James. Are you here? James? That's you? Okay, so then you get 4 minutes.
Thank you.
Wow.
Good evening. H.L. Mencken wrote that for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. Giving this applicant approval is not only wrong, but it's akin allowing Harvey Weinstein produce another film in Hollywood. This man, NMS Properties, Neil Schechner, harassed me out of my apartment and made my life miserable for months. We have been distracted by sexual allegations, but harassment is about power. And NMS Properties have enormous power that has been unchecked. David Martin knows about this. I went to your office and you have ignored, and you passed me to the city attorney, and the city attorney did nothing. And we keep approving projects from this predator of land in Santa Monica, and allowing this to take place in our city is obscene. 3 months ago, Asra Valsani had to start a petition in change.org called Protect Santa Monica Affordable Housing Tenants from NMS Properties. Her unit was infected with termites, silverfish, and ants. It wasn't until our city manager heard of the petition that things got moving. She, like me, was turned away from code enforcement, public health, legal aid, rent control, Santa Monica renters' rights. Is this insufficiently serious for you? The delusional galactic entitlement of privilege of powerful men and women needs to be put to the test here. This company creates an atmosphere of distrust in government. I'm not alone on this, and I'm done mincing words. We are expected to behave civilly, respectfully, and care for our fellow neighbors and visitors. But we allow a developer to roam and harass as he wants. This is the same catastrophic cultural movement that born of the same entitlement that gave us Trump and Weinstein. A cycle of abuse that is obscene. This company preys on the vulnerable, and your approval is an endorsement of this behavior. If privilege continues to go unexamined, power not held accountable, and voices in the margins continue to be ignored in shaping development, how will our city and public space become more just, safe, and equitable? We talk a big game of diversity, and we have the optics to prove it because we have a communications department that is dedicated to sell us diversity. But the reality of it is that when you go to city to help, there's no help for people like me. There's 3 women and 2 men, and I hope that you take into account my concerns, because I come as one, but I stand for 10,000. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there a response from the applicant? No. Nope. Okay. Any more questions, anybody? Or do we want to, yes, Jason?
Yes, you may.
Thank you, Mr. Rand. I want to get clarification on the distinction that you're making between this site and the site that we looked at, whatever that was, the site on 6th Street. So you're putting forth the idea that since within the loose and the zoning ordinance, there were approved standards within that applied to Lincoln Boulevard, and therefore the applicant could have pursued a Tier 2 project that didn't address the parking issues, and therefore should be held to Tier 2 standards. And how do you apply that thinking to the parking program for this site?
I don't follow. Meaning that the zone ordinance parking requirements.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to kind of, this commission made a recommendation regarding the 6th Street project that was informed by the DCP standards. And my question for you is, do you see that the distinction you're making about this site on Lincoln, that should suggest a different approach with the parking program on Lincoln Boulevard?
Well, I would say that the zoning ordinance allows for a lot more parking than the DCP does. And so if you're going to be consistent, or I guess if I'm going to be consistent in the argument, not only would the Tier 2 community benefit standard apply to the Tier 2 compliant DRP project on Lincoln Boulevard, but the parking would too. And so the discussion the commission had last time about concerns over the surplus parking in the building, not the easement spaces, but the surplus spaces that would be used by the actual building itself, by the developer, having concerns about that because it didn't comply to the DCP. I would submit that concern wouldn't apply here because the zoning ordinance would allow more parking than this project has for its building. So I guess that's how I would answer. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's...
No, it does.
Okay.
And what is the current use of the site?
It's a surface parking lot at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Wait, oh, there's questions for staff.
I have a question about trying to get a handle on some more background. Are there, I understand that the 7-Eleven Colorado site is going to fulfill the affordable housing requirements for the project last week and this project here. But does NMS still have any outstanding obligations, any units that are not fulfilled yet, and how many are there? And not only yes or no, and how many are there, but how are they also moving through the pipeline?
Other than, so this is not necessarily an obligation. This was a site that was purchased, as was discussed last time, some time ago, for the purpose of providing an affordable housing project and potentially providing offsite units for future projects. In terms of the obligations that derived from the JSM situation, that is currently being worked out through a project on, I think it's 1437 5th Street, if I recall. That is actually containing all of the remaining obligations from the JSM.
So I think because I think we talked a little bit about this, you and I, during the zoning ordinance update, but so you're talking about that building they call the Sway, is that the one?
That's not the, no, not that one. That one is actually owned, not, yeah, that's not an NMS.
Oh, that's not an NMS,
Yeah,
okay.
it's pretty
So what was the address you said,
1437 5th Street, so it's 100% affordable housing. I think it's senior, if I recall. And that is actually going through ARB at the moment, and that project contains the offsite units for 3 or 4, I can't remember off the top of my head. Maybe it's 5, yeah, maybe it's like 5
Projects.
JSM market rate projects.
And so in any case, but it's not built yet, and you don't know how many units it is. I mean, ballpark. More than 5, less than 50?
44? Shout it out, Russell. 43, thank you.
Okay. And do you happen to know if that, so I think I heard you say a minute ago that obligation fulfills all of that JSM
right.
pipeline? And so how far along in the process is that?
I think our third round of plan check. Yeah.
Okay, and one of the things that I think the Planning Commission discussed last year on this project and didn't really get worked out in the final agreement was replacing the same number of commercial uses that were originally there. It looks like there's at least 4: party, beads, carpet, and like one more, but this has the same amount of commercial space, I get that.
That's correct.
But it's only being realized as 2 commercial spaces.
Well, there are 4 entrances, so it could theoretically be broken up into 4 separate tenants.
I see. Okay, and hold on one second. Do you know the median income? The staff report on page 19 says the city agreed to allow the developer to apply the rent and income levels. We talked about that last week. But the statistic that you're giving me, the data that you're giving me in the staff report is 4-person household in the LA County area established periodically by HUD, but in no event less than 85,400. But that's for a family of 4. So, but this is a senior project, right? So what is the area median income for, let's just think about it in terms of seniors, like either 1 person or 2-person? Do you happen to know what that is?
I don't know off the top of my head now. Do you know? Do you have it there?
So I'm just looking at the income rent limit chart. So based on this one, for one person household for moderate, 63,100.
So 63,100?
Yep.
And that's the area median income for 1 or 2?
1.
1. And so this is going to apply 2 times that?
No, that is the moderate income qualification.
Oh, that's
so
the.
you're.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. AMI would be 31,550. Apologize, I misunderstood what you were asking.
Okay, I might have said it wrong. 31,550 for 1 person.
Mm-hmm.
That's the. You said that was 100%?
That would be AMI, right?
Okay. And does it say do you have 2 people or just going to be a slightly
Sorry,
more?
was I right
it's
the first
just going to
time?
be slightly more than that.
63,100 is the 100% AMI.
Oh.
Yeah, because it's a formula, we're using
Yeah.
2 times the very low, so.
Right.
So can you, I mean, maybe you can just break it down for me, just forget the math for a minute. You must know.
I mean, do you just want to understand the rents or the
Yeah.
income? Yeah, so the rents for a moderate income studio would be 1,577.
A moderate studio would be 1,557, you said?
1,577.
1,577 for a moderate studio. And just say, okay, so then, so then how about a moderate, are any of, and all of the moderate units are studios or 1-bedrooms, right? I see.
Right.
Okay, so then what would the rent be for a 2-bedroom at 30%?
We would have to extrapolate that.
If you could
down.
tell me, that would be great.
Yeah.
It's a formula that the housing department publishes on their website, so. Susan Cola, Deputy City Attorney. These are formulas that the housing department publishes on their website, so you'd have to go on there and look at the actual rent charts that they calculate in order to figure out what the rents are and what the income levels are. But theoretically, it should be on there. So if we have, if you're asking about the extremely low category,
Yes,
and you're asking for
for two-bedroom, for example.
two-bedroom, yeah. So that would be 430. No, this is not the right. Actually, this is right. This is not the right chart. There's another chart. Yeah.
But this one, they don't publish it.
Okay. So unfortunately.
Do you want to explain?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you, Andy. I didn't even realize.
Hi, Andy Agel, Director of Housing and
Thanks,
Economic
thanks.
Development. Let me explain why that's not coming up on the chart.
Okay.
Is previously, we did not have 30% inclusionary units, so it's nowhere on the charts. I
Okay.
believe the first inclusionary that it was actually at 30% was probably the Village Trailer Park. Since then, 30% has been added to the Affordable Housing Production Program, our inclusionary policies, and that's why it's part of the updated chart. If that makes sense.
But they would also extrapolate the rent. So
But that's right. So we would do the same thing. So I could probably eyeball it for you if that's helpful, but it's just keeping the same mathematical sequence to go down to 30% for any units that are subject to the previous rent chart.
Okay, yeah, some kind of, I mean, you don't have to give it to me now, maybe somebody else has other questions or something, but yeah, I'd like to know the amounts.
Are there other questions of staff? Yes, from Jason.
In the calculation of the affordable housing linkage fee, where does the credit come from?
It comes from the 4 buildings that existed previously on site. So they
So just if you could walk me through how that works when it's currently a surface parking lot.
We agree to give the credit occurred when the buildings existed when this application was filed, so they're entitled to the credit towards the commercial space that existed there before.
I see. Yep, thank you.
Don't go anywhere.
Are you ready?
Oh. So Dave ran in his argument that this is a Tier 2 project under the zoning code as opposed to a Tier 2 project under the DCP. The affordability requirement, I apologize, so remind me, the affordability, the number of affordable units would have been 30% AMI unit, 7.5% of the units at 30% AMI, or 10% of the units at 50%, right? So I'm like trying to work through some logic here, right? So, but the building is smaller is the argument that I'm hearing, so we shouldn't necessarily be imposing on this building the DCP level standards because the building isn't, you know, taking advantage of the development standards.
Right, that was the crux of the.
Let me finish.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Right, but both the affordable housing unit requirement is a percentage, right? So it's a smaller building, but it's building a percentage, so that's building a smaller percentage than it would if it was the allowable building under the DCP, right? And the impact, I'm thinking about the impact fees in the same way, right? So the bump up for Tier 2 projects is based on the difference between a Tier 1 and what the project is actually building, right? It's not to what's allowable.
That's right.
So in some ways, the applicant is I guess I'm just feeling like in some ways it's reasonable to ask the applicant to pay the DCP level fees because they would only be paying the DCP level fees on a building the size that they're proposing, which is the smaller building. I'm not sure that.
I'm trying to follow, so the.
Yeah, no, I understand that I'm having a difficult time, right? But I guess I hear the applicant's representative saying, you shouldn't be imposing those higher fees because we're not building to the maximum allowable. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is we're not going to charge fees based on the maximum allowable. We're going to charge fees, or we're going to impose, or we're going to seek, a percentage of affordable units based on what they're actually proposing, which is a smaller amount.
Okay, yeah, so yes, and I think part of this has to do with, when the project was submitted and when it came before the commission, at that point in time, it was before the downtown community plan was adopted, and at that time, it fit precisely all of the Tier 2 development standards, which on Lincoln Boulevard was a maximum of 50 feet, and the FAR. And that was what was being proposed. The only thing that made it a development agreement was because of the excess parking, because of the parking easement, that was being moved from 7th Street. So the real core of the commission's discussion at that time, and that's where the direction of the 14% bump on the fees came from, is, well, this is other than parking, this is a Tier 2 project for the zoning ordinance. So, as a staff, yes, we would normally negotiate for higher, and you've seen us do that, to be consistent with whether it's an adopted plan or, to meet city needs. In this case, given the history of the project, the commission's direction, what it was, and where it is, we felt this was a fair balance. However, the question you're asking, it is a question of policy, certainly, for the commission, given what's been adopted in the downtown plan. We provided in the presentation what the differences in those fees would be. It was something we discussed with the applicant, as well. They were not amenable to, that increase, given, again, the history of the project, and, really the development agreement, is being asked because of the parking, and not some extra, going even beyond, what the height and FAR would otherwise be. Actually, they're below. It could be up to 60 feet, but this project is at 50. So that was some of the thinking in terms of the approach to the community benefits that was taken.
Yeah.
And I think, in our mind, the important aspect of this was really the affordable housing part, of which the project, is providing in terms of its share. It's 30%, which exceeds the 25% offsite.
Yeah, at rents that are so different than what we would require, though.
True.
Right.
Yeah, and that's part of a agreement that we didn't have control over.
Exactly.
For
right.
sure.
So I think I think that needs to be taken into consideration.
Absolutely. And I think that's definitely part of the commission's purview to consider that in totality.
Okay. Thank you.
Jason.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that I understand that staff agrees that at the time that the applicant was submitted, if it had just been an application for that site, for this particular site, that it would have moved forward, it could have moved forward as a DRP at that time, before approval of the DCP. Is that accurate?
Except for the excess parking.
Right. So if it was just for that site, didn't relate to any other properties or any other agreements? Right. Okay, thank you.
All right, let's discuss. Who would like to begin? Amy?
Did the commission understand my logic?
Sorta.
I guess I am inclined to raise the fees to the DCP level fees, same as were paid on the 6th Street project. And the applicant's representative's argument that the building is smaller than the DCP allows resonates with me, except that right, it's a smaller building, so the bump in the fees is gonna be smaller. And I think it's gonna be of an appropriate size to that building, right? I mean, I think one of the reasons that the fees in the DCP are different than the fees in the zoning code are because we had an analysis done, a downtown-specific analysis done, that it was able to demonstrate to us that the value that a property owner gained in just being downtown was sufficient to allow us to, recapture more community benefit. And this property is in downtown, and we should capture that community benefit. And again, I'm gonna stop trying to make my argument about the building size, but I mean.
I get it. Okay.
So anyway, I'll support the project, but I would ask the commission to consider bumping the transportation impact fee, the park and recreation fee, early childhood education, is that another one that gets bumped usually? No, okay. So the transportation impact fee and the park and recreation fees to the DCP levels.
Anybody else?
It's just two, transportation impact and park and recreation. I'm looking on page 3 where it's.
Staff is about to.
And just if it's helpful, it's a difference, we provided the calculation, but it's a difference of roughly probably like $700,000 increase in total across those 3 fees. So for example, the Parks and Rec fee would increase to 1.1 million. The commercial linkage fee, which is currently canceled out because of the credit, actually becomes a net positive of 215,000. The TIF actually, interestingly, reduces to 123,000 from the 150. This is just based on the math.
Thank you, Jane.
Jason.
I mean, obviously, we're in a development agreement situation, so we can, it's all negotiation and just what our feeling is. I want to see the basis for what you're proposing, but I don't, and it's not so much a matter of the size of the project, the height of the project. It's a matter of the timing and the fact that the owners of the property had that chance to move forward with under a fee structure that was leaving a lot of cash on the table, and they did not, in order to address a number of open issues related to 7-Eleven Colorado and to the site for the city's firehouse, and so I look at that and I think it's a pretty compelling argument that their decision to move forward and address downtown's needs, in effect, should not yield a negative outcome for them, as opposed to just proceeding as they had the option to proceed at the time that they filed the application.
Would you like to speak?
I'm thinking.
Okay. Just while we contemplate those issues, I just wanted to bring up a few other things that I had on my mind. I'm always worried about how people are going to get their bikes out of these buildings. And having that shower and that really precious ground floor space always seems like it would be much better used for bike parking up there, and put the shower down one level and just shift that around. That's always, to me, a preferable arrangement. So I would like to see that, and then that freight elevator, make sure it's big enough that especially because it has doors already on both sides, pull it in the parking lot, door opens, pull it out. You don't have to like do the stuff, just a little bigger elevator, make sure it all works, get people on their bikes. Hopefully they won't get hit by a car when they hit Lincoln Boulevard. I continue to bring forward the idea that a DA, even a DA that's not the DA's fault for being a DA, it's still a DA and it's still an opportunity for historic preservation fee. So like we did on the last one, I would suggest that we add a $75,000 historic preservation fee to this one. And I guess those were my two main issues. You know, I mean, these other fees are something we need to see what the commission feels about, but I wanted to add those. Does anyone want to make a motion?
Before you make a motion, is there any more information about the rents that may have, just to help illuminate it for me a little bit more?
So your 30% rent on the 0-bedroom is $473 a month. The 1-bedroom is $540, and the 2-bedroom is $642 per month.
And there's 10 of those. And then the other 20 are 100%.
My understanding.
Is that, yeah, okay. Thank you.
Does that change your,
I'm thinking.
okay. Jason is going to do something.
Yeah, I'll move approval of I'll move that we recommend approval of the development agreement to City Council with changes, the addition of the historic preservation component and the expanded elevator. And what was the item that you had raised in addition to that?
Switching the employee showers with more ground floor bike parking, just reversing.
Okay, so that's my motion.
Okay. Second, I'll second that.
Okay. I'd like to see if there's a friendly motion here to, I'm kind of persuaded by Amy's discussion that, you know, this is a DA and we can ask for a little bit more. And since we do have already the precedent of the original DCP and the study, the Nexus study that was done, but I am also persuaded by Jason's argument that there is no, really, the client, the developer took a risk and went down this road, now they're being punished. So I would like to suggest that instead of a $700,000 difference, we cut it in half and sort of Solomon's approach and go to $350,000.
That's friendly.
What's that?
That's friendly.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I think we're ready to vote, it seems, unless Jennifer has something else to
Can I
add.
get clarification on those rental amounts? Are those before, did you calculate them as 2 times the income limit, or are those before that?
So the way the old rents worked is they took that 50% rent levels, multiplied them to come up with 100%, and then from there you go backwards. So those numbers I gave you are 30% of the 100%.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
So do you have any, yeah, Jason?
Yeah, I just want to clarify, Commissioner Fonda-Bernardi, we're talking about recommending a Parks and Recreation fee of $550,000, and
Yeah, however those were apportioned, we would maintain the same ratio.
well, I guess, I mean, are we also, there was a $123,000 reduction in the TIF fee. Are we looking to split that as well, or just leave that as is?
I think we should split that too then.
Shall we vote? Does anyone need clarification on the motion? It has 3 adjustments. Okay, let's do it.
Okay, Commissioner Anderson?
Yes.
Commissioner Fonda
Yes.
Commissioner Kennedy?
No.
Commissioner Perry?
Yes.
And Chair Fresco?
Yes. All right, so we have approved recommendation of that to City Council. And our next item up is the zoning ordinance changes from bucket 2 that are redlined and ready for our sign off. Do you want to take a break? Okay.
Even though no smokers?
Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break. We've had a request.
Fast food is already allowable use.
Right. The only thing I can see this thing here, it says. So there's just this definition of fast foods, or of restaurant limited takeout. It's just a definition. It doesn't, and it's unclear to me how it was. So let's go. Item 7A, zoning ordinance, proposed changes, corrections, and clarifications to the zoning ordinance related to policy issues that have arisen since the adoption of the zoning ordinance in July 2015 through its implementation.
Okay, thanks. I'll be giving the staff report. We're kind of locked out of the computer, so there will be no PowerPoint. You'll just listen.
Oh.
But you have the staff report in front of you, and there's also written reports by Kyle if anybody would like that. So this is for the zoning ordinance bucket 2A. As the Planning Commission may recall, you adopted a resolution of intention on September 13th, 2017, to consider these items. Previously to that, August 2nd, 2017, the Commission reviewed this second list of issues, and the direction given was to prioritize the ones that were relatively more straightforward and simple to bring those forward quickly. So we have done that. So that includes the 12 changes that are before you tonight. So the purpose of tonight's discussion is to recommend to the City Council changes to the zoning ordinance. And as before, we've organized the analysis in attachment B to your staff report by policy topic, purpose of the standard, how the issue was identified, and what the clarifying language will do. So I'll give a brief overview of each of the changes, and then happy to take questions. So the first batch of changes actually involve the landscaping standards. These were done in concert with the Office of Sustainability and Environment. There were changes made to the Green Building Code, and these are some clerical cleanups to ensure consistency between the Green Building Ordinance and our landscaping standards. Attachment B, yeah, and there's red lines in the report as well. So that's change number 19. Number 22, single unit enclosed garages. So this is a change that is intended to address uses in residential districts that are not single unit uses. So for example, childcare centers and the like. There are other permitted uses in an R1 zone where it may not be practical to have their parking located within an enclosed garage. So this particular red line here allows required parking for all other permitted uses other than single unit dwellings in the single unit residential district shall not be required to be located within an enclosed garage. So it just provides flexibility in meeting those parking requirements. Number 23 is the driveway and apron widths. This is a change intended to bring consistency between the minimum apron width and the standards in the public works requirements of the municipal code. Number 24 has to do with bicycle parking, and this is really a change in a conjunction to change it from and to or. And this is intended to address an issue where it came up in plan check where an applicant read that as absolving them of the need to provide the parking because of that conjunction. So this is a cleanup to address that issue. Number 25 has to do with the on-site requirement for short-term bicycle parking. This is a cleanup intended to clarify that short-term bicycle parking should first and foremost be provided on-site, particularly where we have new construction. The way it was written before could have been construed to suggest that it could be satisfied within the right-of-way for a variety of practical and legal considerations. This red line basically places the preference or the requirement that for existing buildings and changes of use, where existing constraints prohibit locating short-term bicycle parking on site, the applicant shall satisfy the short-term bicycle parking requirements by paying a fee per space. So we've taken out that option of providing it in the right-of-way, again, because of those practical and legal considerations. And that fee per space would be established by council resolution for each space that cannot be located on site. For new construction projects, that is not an option to pay a fee for the short-term bicycle parking. So number 26, substitution of bicycle parking for automobile parking. This is again to clarify language. Certainly caused a lot of confusion, in the course of plan check and also with inquiries that we've received about when substitution of bicycle parking spaces may be allowed. This clarifies that this requirement was intended to apply to existing automobile parking, not someone could not use this to reduce their parking requirements by substituting bike parking. So the red lines here you can see clarify that one existing required auto parking space may be replaced with 5 bicycle parking spaces, and these are substitution of non-required bicycle parking. So it's intended to allow someone to provide above and beyond what they might already have or beyond their requirements. Number 27 is a lapse of rights for the alcohol-related uses. This is intended to really bring consistency between the alcohol time permits and the modifications that were made in the course of the zoning ordinance update for non-conforming or for non-conforming buildings where if they have pulled a permit that they don't lose those nonconformities. So for the alcohol-related uses, it used to be just the 1 year. And if, for example, a restaurant, we've seen this come up over and over again, where a restaurant wanted to open, there was a prior alcohol rights on that site, but after a year, if it was abandoned, they had to come back again. And it created certainly some issues. So this basically acknowledges that if they pull a building permit and during the time that that permit has been issued and they're doing the remodeling, that it extends that time frame equivalently, so they don't have to have that issue where the alcohol rights lapse. Number 29 is the administrative approvals not required in the Ocean Park districts. So this is really a cleanup to bring consistency with the process that occurs right now for building permits for development of more than 1,000 square feet of floor area for new construction in multi-unit residential districts. So within multi-unit residential districts, no AAs are required for new construction and new additions to existing buildings. And the Ocean Park neighborhood district is, of course, a multi-unit residential district. However, in the code, it is not defined as such. So technically, we just need to add this in to clean up that issue. What's happening right now is people are applying for an AA and then coming back and going to Airbnb and going to plan check, and it's basically doing the same process twice. Number 30 is an issue that was raised by code enforcement, and it has to do with holding the property owner, the ability to hold a property owner responsible where a tenant has violated sections of the municipal code. We have heard some concern about this, and we did some additional research and context. So this actually came up in the context of a short-term rental, where a tenant was illegally renting out their unit for a short-term rental purpose. After repeated code enforcement attempts to bring that unit into compliance and trying to be in contact with that tenant, code enforcement then went on to contact the property owner to request if anything could be done, to request their assistance. The property owner refused to assist, said nothing obligated to do that. So this was a request from code enforcement to add that word allow in those situations where they have made repeated attempts to bring a particular violation into compliance, to try and abate that violation, and as a last resort have an opportunity to also hold the property owner responsible for the tenant's violation as a way to bring closure and abatement to that violation. Number 31 is code enforcement of development agreements. This is really a clarification, to ensure that, to clarify that code enforcement staff does have the ability to enforce development agreements, and this really provides a reciprocity with language that's already within development agreements. Number 32, restaurant limited service takeout. This is a modification to the use classification. So this is really an issue of addressing the internal consistency of that use classification. So you can see the full definition is provided there in the red line. Restaurant limited service and takeout includes, the sample uses there include ice cream shops, yogurt shops, fast food restaurants, snack bars, pizza parlors. So, requiring the limited table service aspect of that is really not consistent with the examples of uses that are provided there. We have heard from DTSM concerns about the implications of this in downtown. This is an existing definition. Fast food is permitted within this definition, and that's something that that's not what this is intended to address. This is really a cleanup and internal consistency issue. It is a good question that's being raised, and that's something that we are looking at in a future cleanup to address the concerns that have been raised. And then number 34, we provided two options here. This has to do with the temporary use permits, the limitations on temporary use permits for sidewalk sales for our business improvement districts. At this moment in the code, there is a limitation of 2 sidewalk sales, not exceeding 3 consecutive days within any 12-month period. This has really presented some problems, some limitations for the bids to participate in putting on community events and really even joining with the city on city-sponsored events. And you can see for the Coast Open Streets event was held, we actually brought to council an emergency ordinance to waive this requirement because it would have counted towards one of their 2. The bids often have, a event every fall. Takes them a long time to sort of go through the approvals process. They're community-based events. So, I think staff's recommendation here is that there not be a limit. There wasn't a limit before. It was not problematic to our knowledge. Where we think the two sidewalk sale limitation, it's not clear what the basis of that was or where that came from in the zoning ordinance update. So, we would recommend not having a limit, but if there is a concern in wanting to have a limit, we did meet with the bids, and, the proposal of also a limitation of 6, was something that they felt was also reasonable. And I think you've received correspondence from Main Street and from the Chamber regarding this issue. So with that concludes my report, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Mario has a question.
First of all, let me thank you for making it so clear and blocked out with the rationale, where it came from, and the solution. It was very helpful. I have 2 questions. One in the item 19 regarding the non-residential uses abutting a residential use where we need a buffer. If the non-residential use is a mixed-use building, 1 floor of commercial and 4 floors of, let's say, a residential, does that still require a buffer? As long as there's 1 commercial use in that building, it triggers the buffer. Is that my understanding that correctly?
Right. I mean, a non-residential use is, if it's a mixed-use building, it's not purely only a residential use. So yes, that would apply.
And then the last question was regarding that issue raised by Downtown Inc. I didn't understand. I got a call from Ms. Rose. I didn't understand what the concern was. Can you explain it in English?
Sure. So as you see in the definition, restaurant limited service takeout includes, it's defined as establishments where food and beverages may be consumed on the premises, taken out or delivered. And then as part of this red line, we're proposing to strike out the but where limited table service is provided. And there's examples here, including fast food restaurants. Within the DCP, restaurant limited service takeout is a permitted use, pretty much everywhere in downtown. There is a concern raised by DTSM that does this mean that, for example, could McDonald's open on every corner in downtown? Theoretically, yes, under this code. I will say, this has been in place for a while in terms of a citywide allowance. We haven't seen a mass proliferation of fast food restaurants. That may very well be because there's a preference from those kinds of establishments to have a drive-through, which we prohibit throughout the city. But we do recognize that as a real concern, as an issue, and we are researching. It's not as simple as it sounds to regulate fast food because what's the distinction between, for example, this rise in fast casual? A lot of the qualities of a fast casual restaurant are very similar to what you would think of as traditional fast food. So we've been doing a lot of research in terms of how other cities have regulated this, what are the limits of that, and we'd like to, I think, bring back some options to address that issue because we think
will come back at some future.
Absolutely, yeah, and I don't think we intended to create a consequence of having fast food throughout the downtown.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Well, wow, that's loud. So to follow up on that, though, are you recommending that we recommend it now the way it's proposed, and that what you're saying would come back at a later date, and wouldn't there be a period where something could happen, and then it would defeat the purpose of coming back to with something new to control it?
It's possible, absent. So before the DCP was adopted, we had an IZO in place that actually put a moratorium on limited service restaurants, specifically on the promenade. That was not extended by the council after some consideration of that, and this was permitted, and this is a permitted use and classification in the code. I think when we bring something back, we may look at potentially pulling out fast food in some way if we can, or defining it in some way to sort of get at the issue in a more nuanced fashion. But to answer your question, could something happen in the interim? Yes, it is permitted.
Okay, and I have another question about 30. I talked to you earlier today. I called because I wasn't sure, based on the description in attachment B, where, although it was pretty clear, how that recommendation to add the word allow came about. And you said first you thought maybe that there was an issue with a commercial tenant and that you would look into it further. So I appreciate the fact that you found out that there was, I guess, an issue with a short-term rental code enforcement situation. Right. But what you're saying here, based on that, this modification applies to residential and commercial, right?
It does, yeah.
So have you been able to conjure any unintended consequences of adding this in terms of a tenant-landlord or tenant-owner relationship beyond short-term rental? I'm a little hesitant to add this or keep this one, or say that, I'll encourage perhaps the rest of the commission to say maybe we can pull this one out and give it a little more thought, because I'm just leery about something that would create more of an adversarial relationship between a tenant and a landlord. And so far, with only having this short period of time to think it through, I'm not sure about any unintended consequences at this point. Have you been able to think about that at all?
I understood, and unfortunately, in the short time, no, we were able only to get the background and not have a conversation with code enforcement about kind of something that might be workable, because this is something they deal with on a daily basis.
Right.
And I will say that contacting the property owner when it's a tenant violation, it only occurs after repeated attempts to have the violation abated, and the property owner contact part of it is a sort of secondary or last resort. So I think we need to understand that process more, and I think that the question you're raising is a very valid one, and if there is concern from the commission, I think we'd be happy to hear some of your discussion tonight, and potentially, I think recommending that it be pushed off to our next round so that we can do more research on this is probably a good suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, like, for example, even the word allow it's a different function than establish, operate, erect, move, alter, enlarge. Allow is like a permission, whereas the other words are this action of constructing a visual, although maintain, but maintain is still maintain. So I appreciate your response, and I'll save the rest of my comments about that for the discussion with the commission. And my last question is about the, if I can find it, is the one about the alcohol non-conforming use. Is that language intended only to cover a situation when there's the CUP for alcohol-related use and a non-conforming use going through construction? In other words, it's just for when those two are combined, right? It's just it's.
So this would apply for an existing non-conforming alcohol outlet that doesn't have a CUP, or even those that do. So it's in both cases where you have, maybe it's a long-standing establishment, that has served alcohol. They preceded the requirements for CUPs. So this would apply in that context, and it would also apply where someone has obtained a CUP before, but that CUP has lapsed because the restaurant or the use has been abandoned.
Okay, I need to think about that a little bit more. Okay, thank you.
I have a question. We had, at our last meeting, we brought up, members of the public brought up another change which you informed us was way too complicated to address in this particular go-round, and I thought I did talk to Tony about it, and I just was hoping you would be able to kind of iterate for everyone what's so complicated about it and what you think we can do.
So this is regarding the street wall height.
The street wall
issue, and we did receive correspondence suggestions from the folks who were proponents of the change, and we reviewed what was proposed. A lot of what was recommended was potentially elimination of the standard, which is something that we actually did do in the downtown. If you recall, we took that out and replaced that with a minimum maximum ground floor. We are exploring other potential options to address, really thinking about like what the goal of that street wall height is, and we've seen the results of some recent mixed-use housing projects that have been through ARB, and it does certainly create kind of an odd pedestrian orientation at the street. So I think as a staff, we don't feel that that's the right standard. However, we're talking about a citywide context. Downtown was a fairly contained area it's relatively homogeneous, in parcel type and slope and what have you. We're talking about an entire city, where there's slopes, yes, in the oceanfront district, but there's also slopes elsewhere. And, we really wanted to have the opportunity to test this on real projects and also in different areas of the city to see what's a workable solution. So, that's the time, we're taking to do that. We also want to make sure that whatever solution we come up with actually addresses the issue, which is, as we understand from the applicant, is, to not require a modification, if at all possible, because of this issue. And so we're looking at, ways to make sure that, is that a possibility or is it not? Is it really addressing the root of the issue? So that was, for all those reasons, we need the additional time to make sure that we get it right.
Beautiful. Thank you. Amy?
How much time?
We think in the next round, the 2B.
How about sooner than that?
Sooner than that, maybe.
It looks like we have time on the 15th.
We'll see.
No, we'll have that discussion. We have public comment, right?
Yeah, we sure do. Let's get the public going. All right, we have a bunch here, not too many, but I'll read 3. Hank Koenig, Paula Larmore, and Andrew Hoyer.
Good evening, Chair, Commissioners. When I first saw the agenda, I was lost for words. Last hearing on this item, the Planning Commission, in my opinion, was very clear that staff should prioritise adjusting any ordinance that inadvertently gets in the way of new housing production. So I was surprised that the street wall issue, which is impacting 2 oceanfront district housing projects that we currently have in the approval process, was not included in the items for discussion tonight. I first raised concern about the street wall height issue in the zoning ordinance update red line in October 2014. So here we are 3 years later, and we're still discussing this item. I think it's time to move on and get a little speed going here so that we can then produce the housing and the affordable housing that the city desires. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Oh, wait, there's a question for you.
Yes, Mr. Koenig, can you briefly describe to us why it is that the major modification provisions would not be helpful to projects that are on lots that slope more than 5 feet?
Well, I think the modification process should be for things that are unusual, and I don't think, certainly not in the oceanfront district, having a sloping site. But the modification to height just affects the height. But the way it works, it's the first story street wall height, and some of you may recall I did a few little presentations about definitions of basements. So in our projects, our first story is actually below street level. Okay? So when we talk about first floor heights, well, my first floor is in the basement. The street wall height measures first floor. So how do I measure the height above the sidewalk of the first floor when it's below the sidewalk level? So that doesn't solve the problem.
Because you do not think that the proper language can be put in place as part of the major modification process that would address that concern?
Well, like I said, it's been 3 years already since this was first raised, and there's not been a resolution. So, I don't know what the ordinance is trying to achieve. I mean, these projects we're going through and doing it. But I mean, you've got housing projects that you want to encourage, and once you start throwing in modifications and variances because it's a slope site, I mean, it puts those sites at a disadvantage over a flat site. Developers get nervous about modifications. They don't understand. They say to architects, why can't you design it to conform to code? It's like, well, it's impossible because it doesn't work on sloping sites. So, and like staff said, it was eliminated out of the downtown community plan.
And I understand that, your view that really the code should account for the, predominant situation within a particular zoning district without modification or other options being required in order to, construct a basic mixed-use project, or whatever's allowed in that particular district. In this situation where we do not have the benefit of staff's full analysis of the situation and consideration of alternatives, one scenario may be that we have something in place temporarily, and that process that we have in place temporarily would come with findings. And if it can be worked into an existing process like major modifications, that might be a natural home for it, again, at least as a temporary basis. So I'll just come back. Is there language or concepts that you think could be included within that, perhaps temporarily, that would allow a project to move forward on a site that slopes more than 6 feet?
Well, one suggestion we had was that the, if a project's going to Planning Commission or to Architectural Review Board, well, they're all going to Architectural Review Board, even the AAs, that could be the approval process to do something different. But I don't think it should necessarily, because if it's an AA, you can't have a major modification being reviewed by ARB. But you used to have things in the old zoning ordinance that ARB could adjust things and do that sort of stuff. And since this is really an aesthetic requirement, right? I mean, it's not about light and air or traffic circulation. It seems that they should be able to grant exceptions to that. And in fact, we went to the float up for our 2 projects, and the whole issue of street wall was, they didn't have any concerns. They go, oh my God, this doesn't have appropriate street wall height. In fact, the ARB members really aren't aware of this issue, which is surprising to me. But anyway, look, I get a lot of projects in other jurisdictions where people say, I just want to do a by right project. Full stop, developer, I want to do a by right project. That's what makes my project work, and I can produce it faster. But even if with this requirement, you couldn't even do a tier 1 project as a by right project because of the street wall height issue. So, but basically you're saying there's no such thing in this district on a sloping side of doing a by right project. I don't think that's right. Thank you.
Thank you. Paula Larmore.
Paula Larmer with Harding Larmer Kuttrin Kosel, and I'm just following up on Hank's comments and our request that the commission recommend deleting the street wall height requirement from the oceanfront district tonight. We think this district has special circumstances like the downtown that merit deleting it, as there is a commercial ground floor to floor height already required. In this district, 90% or more of the sites have a slope greater than 6 feet, and it's therefore not a unique condition. Also, this site is a residential district, the only residential district to have this requirement. And so again, we think the simplest way would be to just remove the standard from the district. If the staff and commission wanted to consider whether a different approach should be taken more globally throughout the city or wanted more time to reconsider it, we think that merits approach. But again, we think a temporary solution could be to delete it and then reconsider it. We don't think the modification approach works because a modification for a major modification has a threshold of you can modify it by X feet, and here the entire ground floor is below. So there is no number where we could achieve a minimum above the sidewalk because we are below the sidewalk. So that's why we don't think that approach works, in addition to the fact that, again, since all of the sites in this district have a slope greater than 5 feet, it seems to us that it's prudent to allow a code compliant housing project. Right now you have 2 pending housing projects, both don't comply. So again, we don't see the merit of a modification approach, and we don't think it works from a technical standpoint as well. So I think the other thing is we're just asking not to delay further. We've repeatedly requested, is there a timeline for the next batch coming forward? And we haven't been provided one yet. And so we really would ask this commission to make a recommendation. It seems to us that there's time between this commission's recommendation and council for staff to further analyze whether they could support whatever recommendation this commission makes. But again, like the downtown, we think this particular district is a small district with very few developable sites, merits having the standard deleted. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew Hoyer, and after he's done, it'll be Carl Hansen and Ryan Haas, and I think that's you, Catherine.
Good evening. My name is Andrew Hoyer. I am the Government Affairs Office for Santa Monica Mid-City Neighbors. tonight. I'm all in favor of giving the code enforcement officers more ability to enforce the code. Maybe they'll get around to swinging by 2700 Colorado Avenue on a Friday or Saturday night to enforce the conditions placed on use permit 12-005 given to Ent-Oh restaurant. Beyond that, I'm really here because a member of one of the business improvement districts brought my attention to item number 34. And I was looking at it. I'm all in favor of removing restrictions from the business improvement districts on sidewalk sales. I have no issues with that, and I think this is a good step forward. But in reading this and in reading the change, I downloaded the zoning ordinance. I read all of it for these types of things, and I don't see how this change of just eliminating the line that talks about them actually changes anything. All you're really doing then, you need to put a line in that says business improvement districts are not required or are not constrained by these numbers. Otherwise, I don't see how these temporary outdoor sales appear to be restricted to 4 events, period. And then there's also the following section is about special events, and they're limited to 4 events as a special event, period. This would seem to apply to everywhere in the city, that you are restricted to a total of 8 events, and that's not enough if they want to do First Friday type of thing once a month. All the other things, obviously the sidewalk sales, the art festival that Montana Avenue tried to do, the shop local on Saturday sale right after Thanksgiving, all of these, those would fall under special events, but the following section says no more than 4 special events. So I'm not seeing how the change that the city has suggested actually achieves the desired outcome. So I would suggest just adding a line instead of striking the line about business districts, just say business improvement districts are not held to this lesser amount or can have an unlimited number of temporary use permits. But merely doing what the city is suggesting does not achieve the desired goal. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Carl Hansen.
Good evening, Commissioners. Carl Hansen, Director of Government Affairs for the Santa Monica Chamber of Commerce. I'm here to speak on number 34 as well tonight. Thank you for bucketing, I guess I can use that as a verb, this item. We're happy to see you discuss this. This has been a concern that we've heard from a number of the bids, particularly the smaller bids, regarding their ability to host events, events that the community really treasures. We think the visitors to Santa Monica, residents and employees really like this kind of engaging experience. It's something that I think is valuable given the challenges that retail is facing. This is something that the City Council is directing staff to look at right now in this long-range economic strategy of what does the future of Santa Monica look like given the ease of shopping on Amazon, and how do we keep retail interesting to people. I think the bid board approval and planning and kind of volunteer process itself is a kind of limiting factor on the number of events they're going to hold. I know Main Street at least is interested in exploring the idea of doing something like Abbott Kinney does with First Fridays. They'd like to do like a third Thursday or second Sunday type event, and I think that could be a really good thing for the street, a really interesting way of activating the sidewalks being more pedestrian, bicycle friendly, and we'd really encourage you to go forward with that. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh, there's a question.
Carl, so
Yeah.
In your ideal world, would there be no limit, or would there be a number that you would be comfortable with?
I really don't see a reason for a limit. I mean, I guess the reason that I'm concerned about that is if it ever went one over, then you have to go through this emergency kind of council ordinance approval change, and that's kind of a messy process. But I think if you were allow them to do 12 events plus like 6 for their seasonal things or something, like 18. I think that would be fair.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Ryan Haas.
Good morning, somewhere, commissioners, chair. My name is Ryan Haas. I spoke before you guys last month, so we're making this 2 months in a row. How about that? It's kind of nice. I am the current chair, president of the Montana Avenue bid. And I will say this, this is great. I'm glad that we were able to get it bucketed, move forward. Stakeholders Hansen and Hoyer did a great job of talking about a few of the things. I do agree that I'm not sure either one of these two options really hits it. I think that the second option, just striking it out, kind of becomes, well, then the words business improvement district aren't included in the actual restriction, so that becomes confusing. I think that what was brought up last month was that there was no previous restriction when the zoning ordinance went to the commission for red line. It came back with a 2. Nobody seemed to know where that came from in the arbitrary number, and you guys all seemed to agree that something needed to be changed. Commissioner Fonda
Bernardi.
I can't read, that's all messed. Bernardi, sorry, sir. Restriction on a magical number. In all my research and talking with everybody, I haven't seen this TUP ever abused, right? And so that's, I think, what everybody's afraid of. I think that going back to, and I think staff recommended going back to non-restriction would be I think the best step. And then if there was some sign of abuse or something like that would come about, I think that the commission and the city could enact some sort of non-approval of TUPs based off of some sort of, abuse of that. I will say this, a great byproduct of this whole TUP fiasco, or whatever it is that it's brought our bids together really great. I know that I've spoken with outgoing chairs, incoming chairs, all kinds of different people, and now we're looking at, just in the changing economy, with the changing landscape of just small business, coming together and having more united bid. Like, I'm going to be going to the other bid meetings. That's something that I haven't seen happen in a while. They're going to be coming to ours. We're going to be sharing information and just really trying to work together to help all of our business improvement districts, not just make it, the different commissions' jobs or the city council's problem, but actually kind of coordinate our efforts. So that's something that I'm really grateful for. So I don't know what the exact solution is, but I think that you guys will be able to be smart enough to figure it out. As far as removing the restriction, maybe it just says business approved districts shall be not restricted on the number of sidewalk sales located in an annual year or something like that. Any questions? No? Cool. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Catherine Eldridge.
Okay, I have one question for you, and that is number 22, the one on the garage and the single residence. Does this in any way affect the Delaware project that's before you tonight and before? I'd like to know if there's any relationship at all. Thank you.
Thank you. So that closes our public hearing. Who would like to begin?
Could you explain how, if the child care proposed and appealed would be affected by the 22 suggestion, the amendment to parking? I think it was already partially explained in the explanation, which was attachment B, but for the public speaker, could you explain it again?
Right, it would allow uses permitted in the R1 that are not single unit dwellings. It would provide the flexibility for parking to not be provided in an enclosed garage. It does not absolve the use of providing parking, however.
So, so it would eliminate the need for variance?
Yes, I mean, because it would be, if it's not practical to provide it in an enclosed garage. Again, the intent of that standard was really for, a single unit dwelling, perhaps a somewhat outdated standard. I think it's actually in our bucket 3, part for discussion as to, is it really necessary to have garages to, park cars in the single unit district? But this is really intended to address practical difficulties that we've seen with, particularly with daycare centers and the like, in terms of providing parking within an enclosed space as opposed to parking on the site in some other way.
Which is an interesting thing, though, because garages are there to house the cars, and then it's like saying, well, okay, you don't have to house the cars. But right, but it's because it's for a different use. I understand what still, to an extent, a contradiction. But even if it were to eliminate the need for a variance, you were saying it wouldn't eliminate the parking necessities.
No, we're not eliminating the parking requirement. This is just a design clarification.
Okay, and just another quick question about 32. The title of the item is Restaurant Limited Service and Takeout, but your proposal is to remove that section about limited table service, so then wouldn't you be modifying the bolded heading of that category anyway?
No, I mean, the title is just, that's the title of the use classification, which is Restaurant Limited Service and Takeout versus the restaurant full service. The limited table service aspect of it is really talking about the table service, but the limited service doesn't necessarily need to be table. It's just service in a general sense, I guess. So.
But isn't limited service considered limited?
I think that it provides the option of it happening. It's not a requirement given the examples of the uses that are provided there. Some of them may, some of them may not.
I see. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
I don't have a question, I have a comment.
Comment. Speak.
So I'm comfortable with all the changes proposed. I really appreciate Commissioner Kennedy raising the concern. Commissioner Kennedy, which one was it? About the allow language and the 30.
Right, 30.
So I would support pulling that out for now, because I do think that there are implications in terms of tenant-landlord relationships to explore. And I'd be comfortable with not limiting the TUPs for the bids. But I would like to try and figure out if we can put a time to the street wall height challenge. And that, I guess, put a time to it that's sooner than the next bucket.
Yeah, and I think that we understand the concern with that particular project. It's not holding up the project in some way. There's an EIR, going on. We're not obviously trying to delay the issue. It's just we choose to be careful and thoughtful in how we implement regulations, and I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to do. In terms of the time frame, I think we've committed we're going to bring this back as soon as possible. If it's the desire of the commission to bring that back ahead of other, because the other things in bucket 2, there are some more substantive research, that has to be done. I think that's something that we can certainly, look at doing. So certainly we can do that. I do want to touch on number 34 on the bid issue. Based on the testimony that was raised, I think that it is valid that it could certainly be written clearer that in terms of the option that was provided here to eliminate the requirement, instead of the striking out the entire language, it would be more clear to actually replace that with business improvement districts and areas shall be exempt from the limitations on number of events. So it's more explicit if that's what the commission would like to do.
Thank you. I would be comfortable trying to bring back the minimum street wall height issue sooner than the rest of the next zoning changes.
Jason?
Do we know the timeline for the next round?
To be.
We were actually aiming, our agendas are actually full through the end of the year, so we were thinking the first meeting in January would be the earliest we could bring that back.
Okay, and regarding the temporary use permit, I just want to kind of understand how there are findings that are associated with issuing a TUP, and in a scenario where something's evolving into a large enough activity, or for whatever reason it's creating a negative impact on the neighborhood, does that become a potential reason to deny future TUP requests?
Absolutely. With every TUP, we don't have an obligation to approve it. You know, if there's been a history of nuisance or problems, and you know, we hear about those pretty quickly. You know, if there's a noise complaint or a public nuisance or safety issue, whether from the public or from police department or code enforcement. So you know, with every TUP, we review it as its own individual application. It's not something that is a guaranteed approval.
Okay, thank you. And regarding number 30, and if this requires lots of explanation, we can certainly pick it up later if we're pulling number 30. Does the city have a track record of creating a burden on a property owner for illegal activity of a tenant?
I can't speak to that very well because it's really our code enforcement staff that deals with that. I do know that this particular, adding this one word was really, really important, to their ability to address, and I think, because of the short-term rental issue is something that has been, really top of mind at the forefront. So I think it highlighted the deficiency in this section, which is a section that they cite often. That is the basis for a lot of citations in terms of violations of the municipal code, and where they have encountered that challenge where you have a property owner who is uncooperative or unwilling to assist in a tenant that is violating the municipal code. That was the genesis of this. I can't speak to the frequency of it, but the fact that they brought this forward and suggested it.
I mean, just in terms of the city's practices in enforcing any illegal activities in other areas, is that a practice that's followed in other areas where the owner of a property is responsible for stopping the illegal activity of a tenant, as opposed to the tenant being the one held responsible?
I don't know. I don't have enough information to know whether that's a typical practice or not.
And am I right that one of the avenues for enforcement is fines?
Yes.
And so, at least in the scenario that you're talking about, the fines did not have the intended effect of stopping the activity?
Appears to be the case, yeah.
Okay. So those are my questions. If we're going into comment, I'll just say that I'm fine with with removing the limitation on the number of TUPs issued to a bid in a given year, and so that second option is fine. I support pulling number 30 for further discussion, and I don't know. I think that if the next batch is coming in January, then I think that taking on taken on the question of number 16 and the street wall height. I think that makes sense, and we can make a more informed, have a more informed discussion and a better decision.
Is January okay with you? Does that sound soon enough to you?
I guess maybe I would clarify with staff. Press my button in the correct way. But we do, it's not like out of January, we'll then move into a recommendation to council, right? Our process has been very deliberate, and I really appreciate that thoughtfulness and deliberation, but right, it's like the issue is brought to us, some solutions are brought to us, it comes back, you know, it's multiple steps. So I guess my concern is we have a meeting in January and we're not passing something out to council after that January meeting. We're bringing something back to us that's
Right, it would have to kickstart with the ROI, which we could, did we, for all of them? Maybe we did. If we did, then yeah, then we would jump into actually providing options and red lines into that.
So you do options and red lines, and then we'd have a discussion, and then you'd come back with specific language?
Given the greater complexity of those issues in bucket 2, I presume that one of two ways. One is the commission says, sure, you know, we pick, and you know, we always attempt to provide workable solutions as opposed to kind of leaving it open-ended at that stage. You know, hopefully that there are options provided that are acceptable. To the extent they're not, I think in the past, you know, you've given direction and we come back, you know, if none of the options presented are acceptable.
And I guess there's a possibility that, I don't know how many items you'll be bringing to us, right? If some are more challenging than others, maybe we package a couple together to move forward more quickly.
That's exactly what we're doing.
Okay.
So, okay. Oh, Jennifer has a question.
I have to, I'm sorry, I just can't stop thinking of now about 22. The parking, the uncovered parking. Even though we've seen, for example, lots of, or not lots, but just, I mean, we've had a fair amount of experience now with a use of a child care center seeking a variance and figuring out their parking situation. So I'd like to just focus on that for just or any use, for example. It doesn't really have to be a child care use. But with this modified language, is the discretion removed from, I guess, the commission or anyone for that matter, to find an appropriate place for that uncovered parking on site? Does it enable someone, for example, to remove a front yard to fulfill their parking obligation?
No, parking is not allowed in the front yard regardless. So
we're talking about, in some cases, parking, I mean, existing driveways that might exist alongside a single-family house, for example.
Right.
But
outside of the front yard.
Outside of the front yard. And so, just so to be completely clear, this isn't about eliminating that kind of oversight about, because I think that would
This
defeat
is
the
just
purpose.
this is just a design standard. So other uses other than a child care facility include
Right,
like
I didn't mean to just focus on that one thing, but
duplex, adult daycare, supportive housing, bed and breakfast, schools. You know, in all those cases, it may be impractical. They have, again, this does not modify the parking requirement. The parking requirement is what it is. It's really addressing the design issue of it's somewhat impractical in some of these uses to have their parking requirement to be fulfilled all, you know, wherever they can do it. In addition, but 2 spaces must be in an enclosed garage because it's in a single unit district. So it's really intended to address the variety of uses that are allowed in the R1.
Okay, because I do recall, and I can't remember which one it was, but somebody at one point was proposing to actually remove or maybe it was enlarge a driveway, it encroached into the front yard. I don't know if anybody else remembers that, but I do. So I want to make sure that that still has some oversight and discretion.
This is not changing that standard.
Okay.
Parking is still not allowed in the front yard.
Okay. And then, thanks for that clarification. And then I would just say, I also support no limitation on the number of the TUPs for the bids. I'm also in favor of pulling number 34, as I've already said, for further discussion. But I wanted to add a comment to that, which is, and maybe you've already thought of this, and if you haven't, then you can take my comment and run with it, which is, in the example that you gave regarding short-term rentals, it seems like with all the short-term rental laws that we have, it seems like there's another way to approach that particular problem. So I would say, that is something that should be explored. And if in exploring all of the laws on short-term rentals with that issue, for some reason, the only way it felt that it could be addressed is in here, I would say then it needs closer examination. And to me, at least everything else looks okay.
You want to
I
say
have
something?
one question. Ying. The single dwelling unit enclosure requirement, this is number 22. We're not nesting anything here that prevents the conversion of a garage into an ADU?
This does not, no.
I'm sorry?
It doesn't.
And can you explain why? Because is there something, the ADU code exists and supersedes this? Because it's very explicit. It says for single dwelling units, there should be located an enclosed garage, that seems like.
Right, so that doesn't, so within the ADU part of the code, that establishes development standards for that, and it explicitly does allow the conversion of a
So
garage,
these
and then it
things
has
are
other
not-
parking standards that allow it to be covered or uncovered. That's per state law.
I think we seem to have a consensus here.
I'm going to move approval.
Yes.
You want me to do that?
Okay.
I'm going to move.
With your 3 things that you said before.
Yeah, so I'll move approval. Is that what I'm doing? I'm moving approval. We're removing item 30 with direction on the TUPs to not have any limit. And I think that's it.
You said that we would delay number 30 with the allow.
Yeah.
And the issues around that were, just to look at, were to find out what the traffic record is, what it means for owners to be responsible for the crimes of their tenants, as if they were their parents. And maybe think of language that would narrow it to short-term rentals so that we don't have to head into that territory.
Can I just say, I feel like I totally misunderstood. I guess my concern with this language is, and maybe this is really, maybe I'm really out to lunch on this and this could never happen, right? I guess I'm concerned that residential landlords might use this somehow to facilitate displacement of a tenant.
That was my original concern in
Okay.
calling Jing today, but then it seems to have tentacles, and I think that there's a few different angles about the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's about Article 9, it's about zoning stuff, but I think it's still worth exploration to just make sure that
Okay.
Yeah,
we're
we
not
understand that to be
facilitating that.
to the core concern.
So I think it was just those 2 things.
Well, the
TUP.
third thing was that you wanted to expedite the street wall thing.
I did, but that wasn't, I
But
don't
you-
think that's part of the motion.
No, I guess it's
Yeah.
not. Okay. Then just those 2. I'll second that, unless you want
Please be my guest.
to. Okay, let's
So is the attached resolution is part of the motion, or
Oh.
that's done separately?
The attached resolution.
Well, the
is-
attached resolution
it's
actually,
supposed to be
It's part of it, yeah. It's part of the motion, yeah. And I want to clarify that number 34 is as amended.
number
by
34
staff
would
for
be
the
as
record.
amended because what language is in
Right.
here
Right,
is not
exactly.
the same. Okay.
And not number 30, basically.
As amended and strike 30.
Okay.
Okay.
Commissioner Anderson?
Yes.
Commissioner Fodder Bernardi?
Yes.
Commissioner Kennedy?
Yes.
Commissioner Perry?
Yes.
And Chair Fresco?
Yes. Beautiful. And that concludes bucket 2A. So I guess we'll have bucket 2A1 and then we'll have bucket 2B. We did that. So that brings us to our discussion of our Planning Commission retreat.
Wait, what did I do?
So I sent you all a summary of all of the items that we talked about. Some of you weren't here, so I thought that was needed, of things that we could discuss during a retreat. And of course, I sent you a little delightful historical piece about Planning Commission in Santa Monica. But I just wanted to add, you know, as I was looking at this after I sent it to you, I was just sort of thinking that, well, first of all, we want to hear what you think of this list. I think you weren't here. I forgot who wasn't here now, but, you know, if you have anything to add or subtract or whatever. And I was also thinking, you know, in terms of a facilitator, maybe there are people from different departments or even commissioners who know a lot about one or another topic who could kind of present it to us to kind of, as a way of structuring the meeting, you know, we can talk about things like that. And of course, we all want to know what your vacation plans are. So that's where we're at with this. So would you like to
May I clarify, what is the goal of the retreat? Why are we thinking about having a retreat?
For long-term, broad organization of our work over the next period. Certainly since I've even, you know, I was kind of the first new commissioner after a period of stasis. And now there's a, you know, well, Leslie's not here, but there's a bunch of new ones here now. And, you know, I just feel like we could establish ourselves as a unit better and, you know, work off each other's strengths more if we knew each other better, which could come out of an open meeting like that.
And is the idea that we would do this retreat during a regular evening meeting, or?
No, it would be it would still be a public meeting, but it would be in a place with more comfortable chairs. That's my vision. That's the challenge.
I guess my last comment is, this looks like a long list.
Well, what would you like to remove? Let's, I mean, you know. Jennifer?
If Commissioner Anderson isn't necessarily going to answer that particular question, I'll say I'm fine with all of the topics on here. You know, we've all been to like conferences and things. I could see each one of these items being brought up in a efficient manner. Big picture progress reports, I really like that idea. And I'm not, kind of a related thing. I was recently the liaison over at the ARB, and I got to see a project that received Planning Commission, I guess, approval, or we sent, you know, recommendation to the ARB to look at specific things, and they did that, and then gave the applicant information, and then the applicant came back with a revised project, and it went back to the ARB, and they said sure. But the point is that we looked at the project, and now it's like completely different. You would never recognize it in a million years. And so I would love to sit down, and I think the retreat would be a great place to even talk for just a few minutes about how we could, you know, spend some time, even if it's not at a public meeting, but just getting information like, hey, you know, so this was when you planted the seed here, and then now look at it's a grown tree, and to be able to say, well, here's how our input helped shape it, here's how we spent 5 hours on something that meant absolutely nothing, and everything in between. Like, I think those kinds of discussions would be important if we got reports and got to see things start to finish. Right now, we kind of see things start and they go, and sometimes we don't see it again. So that's me supporting your concept of number 6. And of course, I love the commission report efficiency because that was my suggestion. But no, I actually think that all of these are doable, and even the subcommittee idea and finding out about the strengths of other commissioners and team building is very interesting. So I think you did a great job on this. Thanks for bringing it up. And if I may just ask real quickly, as the chair, it's been a while since I was chair, but as the chair, are you still meeting with David and others, and you do the agenda setting and all of that stuff? And do you guys still have those great Excel spreadsheets, or have you moved on from that process?
No.
Now it's something completely different now.
No, it's right here.
Okay, and do you feel like you have enough
Do you
information?
like it?
Oh, that's back. Okay, that's good. Okay, so, yeah, so it would also be a good time for you as chair to say, hey, here's information that would help me, here's what, and that kind of stuff.
Right.
So I think, yeah, so I'm supportive of this.
Okay, Jason?
Yeah, I'll go through each one and share my thoughts. I think it would be potentially useful to look at our mission statement in advance and come in with some ideas that we want to share, if any, and if there aren't, then maybe a pretty quick item, but a good way to start our discussion at the retreat. On number 2, team building, I kind of feel like we do that every time we meet, and I do not see a particular reason to set aside time outside of our regular course of business here. On the subcommittees, I would, I have a healthy amount of skepticism about the benefit of subcommittees, and I would be comfortable just leaving it to the chair if the chair thinks that in a particular set of circumstances it makes sense. I would, ask the chair to put it on the agenda at a regular meeting and for discussion. On the Speakers Bureau, I think it makes sense to have a discussion perhaps tied in with the number 6, the big picture progress reports, to talk about what it is that we would like to see, to hear about, and that I'm not sure whether that would be, whether the retreat is the place to do that, or conceivably within the context of a regular meeting. So on that, I see it either way. Coordinating with other commissions in the city, I see that as probably something we could talk about in a regular meeting, and with specific ideas in mind on how that would play out, as opposed to talking about it in its abstract. And the commission report efficiency, I think that's very appropriate and potentially very helpful and useful to talk about that in the context of the retreat. And same for number 8. And within 8, legal background, I want to raise the idea that we really have a discussion about the findings. Look at the different types of permits that come before this commission, and really, talk about, because obviously we interpret these findings differently, and there is room within the findings for that, but understanding, what the reason is that we're thinking about those things, and how they all come together for each type of permit. So if commissioners feel that would be helpful, I want to put that out there as an idea. And I'm not sure how you do it, what you're suggesting, Commissioner Kennedy. I love that idea, because I often, this idea of the end product, how does what we're talking about here play out in the real world? I see it as a challenge in that, the projects that we could look at right now, may have been approved 6 years ago, and it was a very different context than where we are today. But I really love the idea, and I'll tack onto it in case there's a place for it within the retreat or within a regular meeting. Just the idea of if there's a way that technology could be utilized within the review process to get a better sense of how projects really will relate to a street, design-wise, massing-wise, and what are the challenges within that, and making sure that the public can come along with the journey if we're putting on VR goggles or whatever, whatever options exist, but just having a clear connection of what's being proposed and what it will be like to experience it once it's built.
Cool. Mario?
I think that actually these are all, thank you. These are all really good points. I'm looking at this thing from a scheduling point of view, if we could sort of go down that road for a little bit. If there are 6 items and we feel that the retreat might be a question mark 3-hour event, 2-hour event, 5-hour event?
No, not 5 hours.
So, I mean, we've been known to go to 5 hours, but.
Those aren't good days.
Right, so if we think of it as a 3-hour event, comfortable chairs obviously might be able to stretch that, but if it's a 3-hour event, we have a half hour on each topic nominally. Is that enough? I'd like to hear other people's thinking on just the time, how to be more efficient, and how do we distribute our time during the retreat? In other words, another way of saying, is 6 items enough, too many, or too little?
I was gonna just jump in to say that I'd say the 2 ideas that are most attractive to me, I think, are actually ideas, are actually things that I think we could do in regular meetings. This is a backwards way of answering your question. Right, the Speakers Bureau, the big picture progress reports, right? I feel like we get big picture progress reports, and maybe it's really just about having clarity around a schedule for those progress reports coming to us, and so that we're comfortable that they're coming to us on a regular basis. And maybe the Speakers Bureau is, I guess this is what it says, Commissioner Fresco, right, is about just identifying potential topics, but the actual speakers would be presented at the meetings, is that right?
Right.
Yeah. I think that was a backwards way of saying those 2 things would be priorities for me if we had to make some decisions about things getting cut.
The one that, I guess Jason had suggested cutting the subcommittee one and just sort of leaving that to if there's an issue, but because we don't typically have them, and there's some background on that that has to do with, I'm not really sure what it is. I thought that's why I put it on here. I wanted, I think that we need to kind of talk about it. In theory, any one of these or all of these could just be spread out over the next 14 months at regular meetings after 5 hours of other discussions. The idea of the retreat is to do it when we're focused on these kinds of things and not those other things. But I kind of feel like we don't really know even how to structure a subcommittee with the Planning Commission based on the extra level of transparency and public, discussion that we're expected to have. And at the same time, when we're doing really big, broad things, like when we're doing area plans and things, sometimes I feel like you know, having a subcommittee of the commissioners who know a lot about housing and having them put their heads together and, you know, what's the on the street way of making the DCP a housing plan. You know, staff has a really technical, you know, this is something that comes from my personal point of view about why we have a commission. Staff is basing all of the things they bring to us on planning theory and broad trends in the country and what other cities are doing, and we're residents and we're people who were in theory picked off the street to kind of look at that and bounce it off and bounce it back and say, well, we're just here for Santa Monica, and okay, we get that that's good thinking out there, but you know, we're here. So the idea of a subcommittee is a chance to like develop our local interpretation of that big stuff, you know, in a more individual way for Santa Monica. You know, I feel like we're carving it. I don't know if I'm making sense, but so, you know, that's why I'm not sure that, you know, I'm the chair right now, and he's saying the chair can decide when it's time for a subcommittee. I don't think I'm prepared to do that without a lot more input.
So is it more about the technicalities of just basically forming subcommittees?
When
that
a
you wanted to-
subcommittee would be appropriate, what kinds of things the commission as a whole would see would be appropriate for that, and then what the process would be for, you know, how it would meet. Would a subcommittee meet in a public place? I mean, how would it, we would just have to decide how it would work and how we feel it would be most comfortable for us and everybody else. So that's why I put it on a retreat kind of a list. So, not to make it longer again, but you know, you're right that we do get, you know, input from staff on how Vision Zero is doing, and you know, how many new units of housing we've had in the last year and all that. So maybe that is not the most important thing. I think that came from a commissioner, I can't remember who, and it might be someone who's not here, so I feel bad taking it off, but but you know, it's true that it is something that we kind of get other ways. So that to me is less expendable. The Speakers Bureau thing, I think, is something that we need to just sort of throw out ideas and brainstorm, and we can just, I don't think that's a long discussion. I think that's just, you know, everybody saying a lot of things, and a lot of it will end up being who can be found to speak to us on those topics and when they can be scheduled. I think it'll be a self-limiting program in that way. You know, I love your idea about the findings, though. That would be a really great thing to do. Yes?
And I don't want to make clear that with the subcommittee idea, what I was suggesting I wasn't suggesting that you go make it happen where you think it should, that you would come to us with the concept and that we would have a discussion along the lines of what you're describing if the concept seemed to, you know, be compelling, that there's a better way of attacking this particular issue than our normal MO.
Well, once we have an idea of what a subcommittee would mean to us, then maybe you would have an idea. That's all. So I'm not sure what we do next. I mean, I would like to schedule this thing sometime before January 2018. So, you know, maybe, I don't know if you guys have thought at all about that sort of thing or have anything to offer.
And I have a question, is like, if scheduling this kind of thing, is it the kind of thing where the planning secretary can help us, you know, poll for dates and stuff like that? That might be helpful.
Yeah, I think that would be the next step. And now that we have a sense of what you want to try to accomplish, we'll find out what dates work for you guys. We should have some indication of, you know, do you prefer a weeknight, you know, an off Wednesday, or would you rather have it on a Saturday morning? Or, you know, I mean, there's, obviously it's up to you. So If we can get a sense, maybe Kyle can call around and just find out from each of you when you're available, what the vacation schedule is for the rest of the year, and then we could go from there.
Okay, so then we just.
Well, actually, can we just take a straw poll and just answer that question, which is your intuitive gut, with two people being absent, obviously, that it would be a weeknight kind of thing or a weekend kind of thing? We just take a straw poll. Or does it matter? Just hear what.
You're asking what my lean
Yeah,
would be?
yeah, just kind of.
I'd say out of convenience to me, I would say a weeknight, but with the concept that the concept as I understand it, probably a daytime event would be more conducive to the kind of free-ranging, big idea discussion that that we're talking about.
Time for me is, I feel like I'm busy all the time. Like, it doesn't, as long as I have the time available, whenever that time is, you know, I'm pretty flexible as long as I have the time.
Mario?
Either one is fine for me.
Amy?
I say ditto to what Jason said.
Well, I don't have to worry about soccer games on Saturday mornings, so for me, you know, to me that does seem, you know, the idea of us being alert and fresh and not after a long sweaty day sounds a lot better. So, you know, so I guess, is that okay? Would you, I know you have a lot of soccer games, so. All right, so we'll try maybe for a Saturday morning unless it's impossible, and then we'll try for a weekday evening. Beautiful. All right. I think we're done.
And I heard a 2-hour target, is that right?
Is that what you heard?
That's what I heard.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's it for us. That was a lovely discussion, thank you. And that brings us to the end of our fine agenda. Does anyone want to, there's one more item? I didn't staple it, now all my pages are mixed up, so I have to look at this one. Oh, yeah.
What's the goal here? To just
Discussion.
clearly represent the planning commission's
At the
recommendation
appeal.
to city council?
Yes. So, I guess that should be somebody who, asked for it to be on the agenda, maybe?
Well, I asked for it just because when someone challenges the planning commission, I think we should.
It's really hard to hear you.
You're not using
Yeah.
the microphone.
The question is, when someone challenges our decision, I think we should be at the table where that decision is being reviewed. Whether we're at the table in the presence with a person or with sending a letter, that's a decision for us as a group, but I think we need to be present. We can't just say, oh, please, city council, take care of this. We don't care what's decided. We should be able to explain our reasoning and how we got to that decision. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that in the past, the commission has relied upon the chair to either present the work of the commission, or, you know, or the vice chair, or another commissioner selected by the chair, obviously, a commissioner who's willing to do so. Are you suggesting some different approach, either of you?
No, I wasn't suggesting a different approach. I just wanted to make sure we had some representation.
You know, I think that a commission should always be present at city council when one of their decisions is appealed. You know, we have special rules that when you're representing a commission whose decision is appealed, you get extra time so that you can really explain the commission's decision. In this particular case, I did not vote in favor of this project and would not be an appropriate person to represent the commission's position. And so I guess I would turn to the vice chair That would be you, Mario. If you want to do it, or if there's somebody else who feels strongly about it, that maybe they want to make a case for their own presence. I mean, it's always best to have the person who has things to say. So.
Well, I'm certainly willing to do it. What I would do is I'll write out what I'm going to say and I'll circulate it to you all or through Kyle, and then you can review and if there's anything we should add or not say as a justification for our position.
Well, everything about our position's on the public record, so hopefully what you would say is
right.
reflective of that.
Yes,
so
but
I would be,
you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, he has to remember it.
Right.
Okay, fine, fair. All right, so that makes it Mario. So now we're done. Nice work. Move to adjourn? Was that what you said? Is there a second? All in favor? Aye. Thank you very much.